The Officio Assassinorum emerged from the shadows of the Great Crusade not as an afterthought, but as a calculated instrument of imperial policy conceived in the earliest days of humanity's reconquest of the galaxy. While the Emperor's Space Marine legions represented the obvious manifestation of his military might, the Assassinorum embodied a different philosophy entirely, one that recognized certain threats could not be countered through mass warfare alone. The organization's roots trace back to the late 30th millennium, when the Emperor and his closest advisors understood that the Imperium would face enemies who could be neutralized through precision rather than overwhelming force. A single well-placed death could prevent wars that might otherwise consume entire sectors, and this principle became the foundation upon which the Assassinorum was built. Malcador the Sigillite, the Emperor's most trusted counselor and the First Lord of Terra, took personal responsibility for creating this clandestine apparatus. His role extended far beyond simple oversight. Malcador functioned as the architect of the entire system, establishing operational parameters, recruitment protocols, and the philosophical framework that would guide the organization for millennia. As the first Grand Master of Assassins, Malcador operated from Terra itself, working in chambers deep beneath the Imperial Palace where even most high-ranking officials never ventured. His selection of candidates for the initial cadres demonstrated meticulous attention to psychological profiles, physical capabilities, and most critically, the capacity for absolute loyalty to the Imperium over any personal consideration. The earliest operatives came from diverse backgrounds. Some were drawn from the feral gangs of Terra's underhives, individuals who had survived environments so hostile that their very existence proved their capability. Others emerged from the warrior cultures scattered across newly compliant worlds, societies where assassination already held cultural significance and technical refinement. Malcador's agents identified children and adolescents who displayed specific markers, not merely skill with weapons or stealth, but cognitive patterns suggesting they could internalize the detachment necessary for their future roles. These recruits disappeared from their former lives completely, their identities erased as thoroughly as their eventual targets would be. Training facilities established during this formative period bore little resemblance to conventional military installations. Located on Terra and several other closely guarded worlds, these compounds operated under absolute secrecy, their existence known only to Malcador, the Emperor, and a handful of trusted administrators. The regimens imposed upon recruits pushed human capability to theoretical limits, combining physical conditioning with psychological indoctrination that rewired fundamental aspects of personality and perception. Mortality rates during training exceeded 70% in some cohorts, a statistic Malcador accepted as necessary rather than problematic. Those who survived emerged as weapons in human form, their skills honed to degrees that seemed impossible to outside observers. During the Great Crusade's expansion, these early assassins deployed against targets the Emperor deemed too dangerous or too valuable for conventional military engagement. Xeno's warlords coordinating resistance across multiple systems died in their fortresses despite seemingly impenetrable security. Human tyrants who refused compliance found themselves unable to trust their own bodyguards. Rogue psychers whose powers made them near invulnerable to conventional assault simply ceased to exist, their deaths attributed to accidents or natural causes. The Assassinorum operated without credit or recognition, their successes measured not in glory, but in threats eliminated before they could metastasize into larger conflicts. The temple system developed gradually rather than through deliberate planning. As the Assassinorum's operations expanded in scope and complexity, Malcador and his senior operatives recognized that different target types required fundamentally different approaches. A Xenos leader surrounded by alien bodyguards demanded different techniques than a human governor protected by conventional security forces. A psyker target presented challenges entirely distinct from those posed by a heavily augmented tech priest. Rather than attempting to train every assassin in every possible methodology, an approach that would dilute effectiveness, the organization began specializing its operatives into distinct disciplines. The execution force protocols, as they became known internally, crystallized around specific philosophical approaches to assassination. The Callidus Temple emerged to address targets protected by their own paranoia, developing polymorphine and other shape-shifting technologies that allowed operatives to assume the physical forms of trusted individuals. Their training emphasized social engineering and infiltration over months or even years, with Callidus assassins sometimes living entire false lives before executing their assignments. The Vindicare Temple focused on extreme-range marksmanship, creating operatives who could eliminate targets from distances measured in kilometers using specialized weaponry that combined the finest human craftsmanship with rare technological components. Each Vindicare assassin trained for decades to achieve the necessary precision, learning to account for atmospheric conditions, planetary rotation, and even localized gravitational variations. The Eversor Temple represented the Assassinorum's answer to situations requiring overwhelming violence rather than subtlety. Eversor operatives underwent extensive biochemical and surgical modification, transforming them into berserker killers capable of slaughtering entire compounds of guards to reach their targets. Their conditioning included rage enhancement protocols and pain suppression systems that made them nearly unstoppable once deployed. The Culexus Temple, perhaps the most disturbing of the original temples, recruited exclusively from blanks, individuals born without presence in the warp, whose very existence caused discomfort in normal humans and agony in psychers. Armed with specialized equipment that amplified their anti-psychic nature, Culexus assassins proved devastatingly effective against targets who relied on warp-based powers. Each temple developed its own training facilities, recruitment networks, and operational doctrines. Temple compounds scattered across Terra and select other worlds became self-contained ecosystems of specialized knowledge, with techniques and technologies jealously guarded even from other temples. This compartmentalization served multiple purposes. It prevented any single security breach from compromising the entire organization, and it created a competitive dynamic that drove each temple to refine its methodologies continuously. Temple masters reported directly to Malcador, providing operational summaries while maintaining strict secrecy about specific techniques and capabilities. The Horus Heresy shattered the Assassinorum's operational paradigm. When fully half the Space Marine legions turned traitor and the Imperium descended into civil war, the organization faced threats it had never anticipated. Assassins deployed against traitor commanders discovered that many targets possessed capabilities far exceeding normal human parameters. Attempts to eliminate key figures in Horus's rebellion met with mixed success. Some operations succeeded brilliantly, while others ended in the complete loss of assassination teams. The heresy revealed gaps in the Assassinorum's capabilities, particularly regarding targets enhanced by chaos powers or protected by demonic entities. Malcador directed significant resources toward adapting the Assassinorum's methods for the new reality of internecine warfare. Temple training incorporated new protocols for engaging chaos-corrupted targets. Weapons development accelerated, producing specialized ammunition and equipment designed to counter warp-based defenses. The organization recruited more aggressively, accepting higher risks in candidate selection to replace losses and expand operational capacity. Several assassination attempts against Horus himself failed catastrophically, teaching harsh lessons about the limits of even the most skilled operatives when confronting beings transformed by the dark gods. The Emperor's internment in the Golden Throne, following his confrontation with Horus, created an immediate succession crisis for the Assassinorum. Malcador had sacrificed himself to maintain the Golden Throne temporarily, dying to give the Emperor precious time. Without their founder and Grand Master, the organization faced an uncertain future. The newly formed High Lords of Terra moved quickly to assert control over the Assassinorum, recognizing its value as an instrument of policy, but also its potential danger if left without oversight. The transition proved contentious, with temple masters resisting external authority they viewed as less qualified than Malcador to direct their operations. The post-heresy reorganization established new command structures and accountability mechanisms. the Grand Master of Assassins became one of the High Lords of Terra, ensuring the organization maintained direct representation in the Imperium's highest governing body, while simultaneously placing it under that body's authority. This arrangement created inherent tensions. The Grand Master needed to balance the Assassinorum's operational security and independence against the High Lord's demands for transparency and control. Strict protocols governed assassination authorizations, requiring approval from multiple High Lords for most operations to prevent the office from becoming a tool of personal ambition. The temples expanded their facilities and refined their selection criteria based on heresy-era experiences. Training regimens incorporated lessons learned from failed operations, particularly regarding chaos-corrupted targets and the unpredictable nature of warp phenomena. Each temple developed contingency protocols for scenarios that had previously seemed impossible: loyalist space marines turning traitor, planetary governors becoming possessed by demons, and similar nightmare situations. The organization's doctrine shifted from viewing assassination as primarily a tool for preventing wars to recognizing it as necessary for prosecuting ongoing conflicts against enemies who could not be defeated through conventional means alone. The Callidus Temple operates on a principle fundamentally different from its sister organizations within the Officio Assassinorum. Where Vindicare assassins rely on distance and precision, and Eversor operatives embrace overwhelming violence, the Callidus approach centers on becoming someone else entirely. This capability derives from polymorphine, a substance so rare and dangerous that its very existence remains one of the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. The drug allows trained operatives to physically transform their bodies, shifting bone structure, muscle mass, skin pigmentation, and even vocal characteristics to assume the appearance of virtually any humanoid target. The transformation extends beyond mere cosmetic changes. Polymorphine fundamentally restructures the user's biology at a cellular level, creating a temporary but complete physical metamorphosis. Polymorphine's origins trace back to the Dark Age of technology, recovered from fragmentary data archives during the Great Crusade's early decades. The substance itself requires components so exotic that only a handful of facilities across the Imperium possess the capability to synthesize it, and production yields remain minuscule even under optimal conditions. Each dose represents months of laboratory work by tech adepts sworn to secrecy, combining organic compounds harvested from rare xeno specimens with synthetic elements that push the boundaries of Imperial chemical engineering. The temple maintains absolute control over polymorphine supplies, with every single dose tracked through elaborate security protocols that would make administratum clerks weep with envy. The human body violently rejects polymorphine without extensive preparation. Callidus recruits undergo years of biological modification before they can survive even their first transformation. Surgeons implant specialized glands throughout the candidate's body, creating secondary organ systems that regulate polymorphine's effects and prevent the catastrophic cellular breakdown that kills unmodified users within minutes of exposure. These glands connect to the lymphatic system through artificially created channels, allowing them to distribute polymorphine evenly throughout the body, while simultaneously producing counter agents that prevent the transformation from becoming permanent or uncontrolled. The implantation process alone claims roughly 30% of candidates, their bodies rejecting the foreign organs despite immunosuppressant drugs and constant medical monitoring. Additional modifications reinforce skeletal structures to withstand the stress of rapid bone reformation. Callidus operatives receive ceramic lattice implants throughout their skeletons, microscopic reinforcements that prevent fractures when bones lengthen, shorten, or change density during transformation. Their muscle tissues undergo genetic manipulation that increases elasticity far beyond human norms, allowing fibers to stretch or compress without tearing as body mass shifts. Even their skin receives treatment. Specialized cells injected into the dermal layers grant the flexibility needed to accommodate dramatic changes in body size and shape without splitting or creating obvious scarring. The transformation process itself inflicts agony that defies adequate description. Operatives who have undergone dozens of polymorphine shifts report that the pain never diminishes, never becomes tolerable through familiarity. Bones crack and reform, joints dislocate and relocate, muscles tear and reknit, all while the operative remains fully conscious and aware. The Callidus Temple forbids the use of pain suppressants during transformation, maintaining that operatives must retain complete mental clarity to guide the physical changes and ensure accuracy. A transformation typically requires between 15 and 40 minutes, depending on the degree of physical difference between the operative's natural form and their target appearance. During this period, the operative must maintain absolute focus, visualizing their target's features in minute detail, while their body reshapes itself through controlled chemical metamorphosis. Training in polymorphine use begins with minor alterations, changing eye color, adjusting facial features slightly, modifying height by a few centimeters. Instructors drill candidates relentlessly on maintaining transformation stability, teaching them to hold their assumed forms for days or even weeks without reversion. Advanced operatives learn to shift between multiple identities in rapid succession, a skill that proves invaluable during complex infiltration operations, where circumstances change unexpectedly. The most accomplished Callidus assassins can maintain transformations for months, living entire false lives without their bodies betraying them through involuntary reversion or partial shifts. Deep cover infiltration represents the Callidus Temple's primary operational methodology. Unlike other temples that deploy operatives for relatively brief missions measured in days or weeks, Callidus assassins frequently spend years establishing their false identities before executing their actual assignments. This approach requires patience that borders on the inhuman, with operatives sometimes living as their target's trusted advisors, bodyguards, or even family members for extended periods. The psychological demands of such prolonged deception exceed the physical challenges of polymorphine use, requiring mental conditioning that fundamentally alters how operatives perceive identity and self. Callidus training incorporates extensive psychological programming designed to create compartmentalized personalities. Operatives learn to construct complete false identities with their own memories, preferences, behavioral patterns, and emotional responses. These constructed personas exist as fully realized psychological entities within the operative's mind, capable of responding naturally to unexpected situations without breaking character. The technique draws on principles similar to those employed by the Inquisition's most skilled interrogators, but inverted. Rather than breaking down psychological defenses, Callidus conditioning builds additional layers of personality that can be activated or suppressed as missions require. Cultural assimilation protocols form a critical component of infiltration training. Callidus operatives study thousands of different human cultures across the Imperium, learning regional dialects, social customs, religious practices, and behavioral norms that vary wildly between worlds. An operative assigned to infiltrate a hive world gang must understand the complex hierarchy systems, territory markers, and combat rituals that govern underhive life. Another tasked with replacing a noble courtier needs mastery of aristocratic etiquette, political maneuvering, and the subtle social signals that mark insider status. The temple maintains vast databases of cultural information, constantly updated by operatives returning from missions and by information brokers who never realize they serve the Assassinorum. Language acquisition receives particular emphasis. Callidus assassins typically achieve fluency in dozens of languages and can convincingly mimic hundreds of regional accents and speech patterns. This capability extends beyond simply speaking correctly. Operatives learn the subtle differences in vocabulary choices, sentence structure preferences, and conversational rhythms that distinguish a native speaker from even a highly skilled foreigner. Training includes extensive practice in maintaining linguistic consistency under stress, ensuring that operatives won't accidentally revert to their natural speech patterns during crisis situations. The Khatan phase sword serves as the Callidus Temple's signature weapon, a blade that exists partially out of phase with real space. The weapon's origins remain mysterious even to most Callidus operatives, though senior temple officials acknowledge its connection to ancient Xenos technology predating the Imperium. The phase sword appears as a slender, single-edged blade approximately 60 centimeters in length, its surface displaying a peculiar quality that makes it difficult to focus on directly. The metal itself, if metal accurately describes the substance, shifts between states of matter in ways that violate conventional physics, creating a cutting edge that passes through most materials with minimal resistance. Phase sword construction remains a closely guarded secret known only to the temple's master artificers and select tech priests bound by the most severe oaths of secrecy. Each blade requires years to produce, incorporating materials and techniques that cannot be replicated by standard imperial manufacturing processes. The weapons demonstrate strange properties beyond their cutting capability. They generate no heat signature, produce no sound when moving through air, and register inconsistently to most detection equipment. These characteristics make phase swords ideal for assassination work, allowing operatives to carry lethal weapons that escape notice from security scanners and auger arrays. Combat techniques developed for phase sword use differ markedly from standard Imperial blade work. The weapon's ability to pass through armor and force fields demands precision rather than power, with strikes focusing on vital organs and major blood vessels, rather than attempting to overpower an opponent's defenses through brute force. Callidus training emphasizes speed and accuracy, teaching operatives to identify vulnerable points on targets ranging from unaugmented humans to heavily modified combat servitors. The phase sword proves particularly effective against targets wearing powered armor or protected by conversion fields, as the blade's unusual properties allow it to bypass such defenses entirely when wielded with proper technique. The Neural Shredder provides Callidus operatives with a ranged option for situations where close combat proves impractical or excessively risky. This compact weapon projects a focused beam of psycho-conductive energy that disrupts neural activity in its target, causing immediate incapacitation or death depending on exposure duration and intensity. The Neural Shredder's effective range extends to approximately 30 meters under optimal conditions, though accuracy degrades significantly beyond 15 meters due to atmospheric interference and the beam's tendency to disperse. The weapon produces minimal visual signature, merely a slight distortion in the air similar to heat shimmer, making it difficult for witnesses to identify the source of attack. Neural Shredder effects vary based on target physiology and the weapon's power setting. Against unaugmented humans, even brief exposure causes severe disorientation, temporary paralysis, and often permanent neural damage. Extended exposure literally burns out neural pathways, reducing victims to vegetative states or causing immediate brain death. Targets with extensive cybernetic augmentation demonstrate increased resistance, as artificial neural interfaces can sometimes absorb or redirect the weapon's energy before it reaches organic brain tissue. The Callidus Temple continuously refines Neural Shredder technology to counter emerging defensive measures, engaging in an ongoing arms race against those who would protect themselves from the Imperium's assassins. Notable Callidus operations span the Imperium's 10,000-year history, though records of most missions remain sealed within the Temple's archives. The assassination of Genestealer cult patriarchs represents one category of target where Callidus capabilities prove especially valuable. These Xenos hybrid creatures typically surround themselves with fanatically loyal cultists whose psychic connection to their patriarch makes conventional infiltration nearly impossible. Cultists can often sense imposters through their shared brood-mind connection. Callidus operatives counter this advantage by assuming the identities of cult members before they fully develop their psychic links, sometimes infiltrating cults years before the patriarch's emergence. Once in position, the operative waits for the optimal moment to strike, using phase swords to eliminate the patriarch before the broodmind can coordinate a response. One documented operation involved a Callidus assassin who spent 8 years embedded within a cult on the hive world of Tefane. The operative assumed the identity of a mid-ranking cultist, participating in the cult's activities and even undergoing minor Xenos taint modifications to maintain her cover. When the Patriarch finally emerged from its underground lair to lead a planned uprising, the assassin struck during a cult gathering, killing the creature with a single-phase sword thrust through its primary brain cluster. The brood minds collapsed through the cult into disarray, allowing Imperial forces to purge the Xeno's taint before it could spread further through the hive's population. Infiltration of heretical planetary governments provides another common mission profile for Callidus operatives. Corrupt governors who have turned from the Emperor's light often maintain elaborate security arrangements precisely because they fear Imperial retribution. Callidus assassins bypass such precautions by becoming trusted members of the governor's inner circle, sometimes replacing actual advisors or bodyguards after careful study of their target's mannerisms and relationships. The operative then waits for circumstances that allow for assassination without immediately revealing Imperial involvement, creating situations that appear as accidents, internal power struggles, or attacks by rival factions. The Culexus Temple draws its operatives from the rarest and most disturbing subset of humanity, those born without souls. These individuals, designated as pariahs or blanks in Imperial records, possess the pariah gene, a genetic anomaly so rare that it manifests in perhaps one individual per billion births. The exact mechanisms underlying this mutation remain poorly understood even by the Adeptus Biologists, though current theories suggest it represents a form of inverse psychic potential. Where psychers project their consciousness into the warp, blanks create voids, areas where the warp cannot reach, where psychic energy dissipates harmlessly, where demons cannot manifest. This absence of presence in the immaterium marks them as fundamentally wrong to every other human being, triggering deep-seated revulsion that operates below conscious awareness. Normal humans experience profound discomfort in the presence of blanks, a sensation they struggle to articulate or rationalize. The feeling manifests as instinctive distrust, inexplicable anxiety, and a powerful desire to remove themselves from the blank's vicinity. Parents of blank children frequently abandon or kill their offspring, unable to overcome the visceral wrongness they perceive. Communities that discover blanks in their midst typically respond with violence, viewing these soulless individuals as cursed or tainted regardless of their actual behavior. This universal rejection creates populations of outcasts who survive on society's margins, shunned and despised for qualities they cannot control or change. The Culexus Temple recruits exclusively from these unfortunates, offering them purpose and belonging in exchange for service as weapons against the Imperium's psychic enemies. The pariah gene's effects extend beyond simple absence. It actively negates psychic phenomena within its sphere of influence. Psychers near blanks experience their powers weakening or failing entirely, as though attempting to draw water from a dry well. The sensation reportedly combines physical nausea with psychological horror, as psychers feel their connection to the warp severed by the blank's presence. Powerful psychers can sometimes overcome this effect through sheer force of will, but even they find their abilities significantly diminished. Demons and other warp entities suffer even more severely, finding themselves unable to maintain cohesion in real space when confronted by a blank's anti-presence. Some demons simply dissipate when approaching sufficiently powerful pariahs, their essence unable to sustain manifestation against the void. The Culexus Temple's recruitment networks span the Imperium, identifying potential candidates through various means. Some blanks come to attention when local authorities investigate unexplained phenomena, communities plagued by mysterious psychological disturbances that cease when a particular individual departs, or psychers who suddenly lose their abilities after encountering specific people. Others emerge from Schola Progenium institutions, where their presence disrupts sanctioned psychers assigned to the facilities. The black ships occasionally deliver blanks discovered during their tithes, recognizing that these individuals serve the Imperium better as assassins than as curiosities or test subjects. Regardless of source, all candidates undergo extensive evaluation before the temple commits resources to their training. Initial assessment focuses on measuring the candidate's anti-psychic strength, designated as their negative rating on the assignment scale. This classification system ranges from A to grade blanks, whose effects barely register to nearby psychers, through increasingly powerful designations up to Omega- individuals, whose very existence creates psychic dead zones spanning dozens of meters. The Culexus Temple prefers candidates rating Delta or higher, as weaker blanks lack sufficient anti-psychic strength to function effectively as assassin operatives. Testing procedures involve exposing candidates to sanctioned psychers of various power levels while monitoring both parties' responses. Candidates who cause severe distress in alpha-grade psychers or who can disrupt psychic phenomena at significant distances receive priority consideration. Physical capability matters less for Culexus recruitment than for other temples, though candidates still require baseline human fitness and coordination. The temple's enhancement procedures and specialized equipment compensate for physical limitations, transforming even relatively weak candidates into lethal operatives. Psychological stability proves more critical. Candidates must demonstrate sufficient mental resilience to withstand the isolation and rejection that defines their existence. Blanks who have developed self-destructive tendencies or who exhibit signs of severe psychological damage from years of ostracism typically fail screening, as the temple requires operatives capable of maintaining focus and discipline despite their condition. Training begins with isolation protocols designed to weaponize the operative's inherent soullessness. Culexus candidates spend months in complete solitude, confined to chambers deep within the temple's facilities, where they experience no human contact whatsoever. Servitors deliver food and remove waste, but even these interactions occur through automated systems that prevent direct exposure to the candidates. This enforced isolation serves multiple purposes. It acclimates candidates to the loneliness that will define their service, eliminates any remaining hope of normal human relationships, and allows their anti-psychic auras to strengthen without interference. Candidates emerge from isolation fundamentally changed, having accepted their nature as weapons rather than people. Subsequent training focuses on enhancing and controlling the operative's negative presence. Instructors, themselves blanks of sufficient power to train others, teach techniques for concentrating anti-psychic effects, directing them toward specific targets rather than radiating them indiscriminately. These methods combine mental discipline with physical positioning, as operatives learn to maximize their impact through proper stance and breathing patterns. Advanced practitioners can create directional fields of psychic negation, projecting their soullessness toward enemies while minimizing effects on nearby allies. The training proves mentally exhausting, requiring concentration levels that leave operatives drained after even brief practice sessions. Combat instruction emphasizes exploiting the psychological impact of the operative's presence. Opponents confronting Culexus assassins experience immediate disorientation and dread, their hindbrains screaming warnings about the wrongness approaching them. Training teaches operatives to press this advantage, using aggressive tactics that prevent enemies from adapting to their discomfort. Culexus assassins learn to fight in ways that maximize physical contact, as touching a blank intensifies the revulsion effect dramatically. Grappling techniques in close-quarters combat receive extensive practice, with operatives drilling endlessly on methods for maintaining physical contact while delivering lethal strikes. The animus speculum represents the Culexus Temple's most devastating weapon, a helmet-mounted device that transforms the assassin's negative presence into a focused beam of soul, destroying energy. The device itself consists of a Baroque helmet that completely encases the operative's head, featuring a single large lens mounted where the face would be. This lens serves as both sensor array and weapon aperture, gathering psychic energy from the surrounding environment and channeling it through the operative's anti-presence to create a beam of pure negation. The helmet's internal mechanisms interface directly with the operative's nervous system through neural plugs implanted during training, creating a direct connection between the assassin's consciousness and the speculum's targeting systems. Activation of the animus speculum requires the operative to focus their anti-psychic nature through the device's amplification matrices. The helmet draws upon the warp energy present in all living beings, siphoning this energy and inverting it through the operative's soulless nature before projecting it as a visible beam of crackling black-purple energy. The beam's appearance defies normal description. Witnesses report seeing something that resembles lightning but moves wrongly, that seems to absorb light rather than emit it, that causes physical pain to observe directly. The energy travels at near instantaneous speeds across distances up to several hundred meters, though accuracy degrades significantly beyond 50 meters due to atmospheric dispersion. Targets struck by animus speculum fire experience effects that vary based on their psychic sensitivity. Unaugmented humans with no psychic potential suffer immediate neural trauma as the beam disrupts their basic biological functions, causing brain death within seconds of exposure. Psychers face far worse fates. The beam literally tears their souls from their bodies, unraveling their connection to the warp while simultaneously destroying their physical forms. Witnesses describe victims aging decades in seconds, their bodies withering as the life force drains away. Some psychers simply explode, unable to contain the catastrophic feedback as their powers turn inward. The weapon proves particularly effective against demons, whose warp-based existence makes them exquisitely vulnerable to the speculum's soul-destroying properties. Operation of the animus speculum inflicts significant strain on the Culexus operative. Each firing drains the assassin's physical reserves, causing exhaustion that increases with repeated use. The helmet's neural interface creates feedback that many operatives describe as feeling their own soullessness reflected back at them, a sensation that borders on existentially disturbing, even for blanks accustomed to their nature. Extended combat operations requiring multiple speculum discharges can leave operatives temporarily catatonic, their nervous systems overwhelmed by the weapon's demands. The temple trains operatives to manage this drain, teaching conservation techniques and tactical approaches that minimize unnecessary weapon usage. Specialized wargear supplements the animus speculum in Culexus loadouts. Operatives wear form-fitting body gloves constructed from psychically resistant materials that enhance their natural anti-warp properties while providing modest physical protection. These suits incorporate stealth systems that make the wearer difficult to detect through conventional means, though the operative's psychic absence often alerts sensitive individuals to their presence regardless of visual concealment. Sick-out grenades provide area denial capabilities, releasing clouds of psychically reactive particles that disrupt warp-based powers and cause severe disorientation in psychers. The particles derive from processed remains of sanctioned psychers, their residual psychic signatures inverted and weaponized in a process the temple refuses to explain in detail. Deployment protocols for Culexus assassins differ significantly from those governing other temples. The operative's disturbing nature makes covert insertion challenging, as their presence triggers alarm responses in nearby humans even when they remain physically hidden. Mission planning typically accounts for this limitation by deploying Culexus operatives during chaotic situations where the general confusion masks their approach, or by utilizing insertion methods that minimize exposure to bystanders. Teleportation represents a preferred deployment method when available, placing the operative directly into combat zones where their psychic absence becomes apparent only after they engage targets. Operations against rogue psychers constitute the most common Culexus mission profile. Unsanctioned psychers who evade black ship tithes and develop their powers independently pose severe threats to Imperial citizens, as their untrained abilities frequently manifest in catastrophic ways. Culexus assassins hunt these individuals with ruthless efficiency, their anti-psychic nature rendering the rogues' powers useless. A typical engagement involves the operative approaching to close range, while the target experiences increasing distress and power failure. The rogue psyker usually attempts to flee, finding their abilities unresponsive or wildly unstable. The Culexus closes distance methodically, often allowing the target to exhaust themselves through futile escape attempts before delivering execution via animus speculum or physical means. Chaos sorcerers present more challenging targets, as their centuries of experience and demonic patrons provide resources unavailable to common rogue psychers. These corrupted individuals typically maintain elaborate defenses specifically designed to counter Imperial assassination attempts, including bound demons, warp-spawned guardians, and psychic wards that alert them to approaching threats. Culexus operatives bypass many such defenses through their unique nature. Psychic detection systems fail to register their approach, bound demons weaken or dissipate as the assassin draws near, and warp-based guardians find themselves unable to maintain cohesion. The sorcerer usually realizes danger only when their powers begin failing, often too late to mount effective resistance. The Thousand Suns Traitor Legion represents a priority target category for Culexus operations. These Chaos Space Marines rely extensively on psychic powers, with many reduced to little more than animated armor inhabited by warp entities following the rubric of Ahriman. Culexus assassins prove devastatingly effective against rubric Marines, as their anti-psychic presence disrupts the sorcery binding the entities to their armor. Rubrici exposed to sufficiently powerful blanks simply collapse, the animating force unable to maintain cohesion against the psychic void. Thousand Suns sorcerers who lead these warbands face similar vulnerabilities, finding their centuries of accumulated power useless against an enemy whose very existence negates the warp. Documented engagements include operations during the Obscura Sector campaigns of the 41st millennium, where Culexus operatives deployed against Thousand Suns warbands raiding Imperial worlds for arcane artifacts. One recorded mission involved a single Culexus assassin infiltrating a Thousand Suns warband's temporary base on the dead world of Morthaven. The operative approached the Sorcerer Lord commanding the warband during a ritual summoning, the assassin's presence causing the summoned demon to dissipate before manifestation could complete. The Sorcerer Lord attempted to defend himself with pyromantic powers, only to watch his flames gutter and die as the Culexus closed distance. The Animus Speculum's discharge reduced the ancient Chaos Space Marine to withered remains inside his ornate armor, his soul torn from his body despite millennia of warp-granted resilience. Xeno's Witches provide another target category where Culexus capabilities prove essential. Eldar Farseers, Orc Weirdboys, and similar alien psychers wield powers that conventional Imperial forces struggle to counter effectively. The alien psychic abilities often exceed those of human psychers, enhanced by racial traits and millennia of refinement. Culexus operatives level this disparity, their anti-psychic nature affecting Xeno's psychers as severely as human ones. Eldar reportedly find blanks particularly disturbing, as their psychically attuned nature makes them exquisitely sensitive to the operative's soulless void. Farseers who glimpse Culexus assassins in their prophetic visions sometimes alter entire craftworld strategies to avoid encountering these disturbing enemies. The psychological toll of Culexus service extends beyond normal human comprehension. Operatives spend their entire lives isolated from meaningful human contact, their presence too disturbing for others to tolerate. Even within the temple, interactions remain minimal and strictly professional. Operatives develop coping mechanisms that range from complete emotional detachment to elaborate internal fantasy lives that provide psychological refuge from their isolation. The temple monitors operatives for signs of mental breakdown, retiring those who can no longer maintain operational effectiveness. Retirement typically involves assignment to training roles or research projects where the operative's anti-psychic properties serve useful purposes without requiring field deployment. The Eversor Temple operates on a philosophical principle that stands in stark contrast to the subtlety employed by other Assassinorum clades. Where Callidus operatives spend years establishing false identities and Vindicare assassins eliminate targets from kilometers away, Eversor assassins represent pure, overwhelming violence distilled into human form. The Temple's doctrine accepts collateral damage as inevitable and often desirable, recognizing that certain targets require not merely death but complete destruction of their support structures, bodyguards, and immediate associates. An Eversor deployment sends an unmistakable message to the Imperium's enemies. There exists no fortress impregnable enough, no bodyguard force large enough to guarantee protection from Imperial retribution. The transformation of a human being into an Eversor operative begins with extensive surgical modification that pushes the boundaries of what the mechanicus considers acceptable augmentation of the human form. Candidates undergo procedures that replace or enhance virtually every major organ system, creating bodies capable of surviving stresses that would kill unmodified humans within seconds. The cardiovascular system receives particular attention, with surgeons installing additional hearts, typically 2 or 3 beyond the natural organ, along with reinforced arterial walls capable of withstanding blood pressure levels that would rupture normal vessels. These modifications allow Eversor operatives to maintain combat effectiveness even after suffering injuries that would incapacitate Space Marines, their redundant organ systems compensating for catastrophic damage. Muscular enhancement involves both surgical and chemical intervention. Surgeons weave synthetic fiber bundles throughout the operative's existing muscle tissue, creating a hybrid structure that combines biological muscle with artificial components. These fibers respond to neural impulses identically to natural muscle, but generate force output far exceeding human norms. The operative's skeletal structure requires corresponding reinforcement to handle the stress generated by enhanced musculature. Bones receive ceramic and adamantium lattice implants that increase density and tensile strength while maintaining flexibility. The combination allows Eversor assassins to perform feats of strength comparable to unarmored Space Marines, tearing through reinforced doors and crushing human skulls with their bare hands. Neurological modification represents perhaps the most extensive aspect of Eversor augmentation. Surgeons implant neural accelerators throughout the operative's brain and spinal column, artificial nodes that speed signal transmission between neurons. These implants reduce reaction times to levels bordering on precognition, allowing Eversor operatives to respond to threats before conscious thought processes register danger. The accelerators connect to additional implants in the visual cortex and auditory processing centers, enhancing sensory perception to match the operative's improved reaction speed. An Eversor assassin perceives the world in a state of perpetual slow motion during combat, watching bullets travel through air and tracking individual movements in crowds of dozens. Pain response receives complete elimination through a combination of neural editing and chemical suppression. Surgeons sever specific nerve pathways that transmit pain signals while leaving intact those necessary for proprioception and basic sensory feedback. Backup chemical systems flood the operative's bloodstream with endorphin analogs during combat, ensuring that even catastrophic injuries fail to impair performance. Eversor operatives continue fighting with broken bones, severed limbs, and organ damage that would leave normal humans writhing in agony. Mission reports document instances of Eversor assassins completing their assignments despite injuries that killed them within minutes of target elimination, their modified bodies refusing to cease function until the mission parameters were satisfied. The biochemical cocktail that defines Eversor combat capability consists of dozens of individual compounds, each serving specific purposes in the operative's transformation from human being to killing machine. Frenzon forms the foundation of this mixture, a combat stimulant that eliminates fear responses and enhances aggression to pathological levels. The drug works by suppressing activity in the brain's prefrontal cortex while simultaneously stimulating the amygdala and other limbic system structures associated with rage and territorial behavior. Frenzon users experience reality through a lens of pure aggression, perceiving everything around them as either targets to destroy or obstacles to overcome. The Eversor Temple employs a refined variant of standard Imperial Frenzon, one that maintains just enough cognitive function to allow operatives to distinguish mission targets from bystanders, though this distinction often proves academic given the Temple's acceptance of collateral casualties. Slot represents another critical component, a stimulant so powerful that unmodified humans who ingest it typically suffer fatal cardiac arrest within minutes. The drug dramatically increases metabolic rate, allowing cells to generate energy at rates far exceeding normal biological limits. Slot users move with supernatural speed, their enhanced metabolism providing the energy necessary to fuel augmented muscles and accelerated neural processing. The drug's side effects include extreme aggression, reduced impulse control, and a tendency towards psychotic episodes, effects that prove advantageous rather than problematic for Eversor operations. The Temple's variant includes stabilizing compounds that prevent the immediate cardiac failure common with crude slot formulations, allowing operatives to maintain peak performance for extended periods. Additional compounds in the Eversor cocktail address specific operational requirements. Stims maintain alertness and focus despite the massive energy expenditure of combat operations. Coagulant boosters accelerate blood clotting to prevent death from hemorrhage, working in concert with the operative's enhanced cardiovascular system to maintain blood pressure even after significant blood loss. Synthetic adrenaline analogs provide sustained energy without the crash associated with natural adrenaline depletion. Antitoxins counter poisons and chemical weapons that enemies might employ against the assassin. Muscle relaxants prevent the cramping and spasms that would otherwise result from the extreme exertion demanded during missions. The delivery system for these chemicals consists of an elaborate network of implanted reservoirs and injection mechanisms distributed throughout the operative's body. Primary reservoirs nestle against the spine, protected by the vertebrae and surrounded by redundant pumping mechanisms that ensure chemical delivery continues even if individual components suffer damage. Secondary reservoirs occupy spaces throughout the torso and limbs, creating a distributed system with no single point of failure. Microinjectors connect to major blood vessels, capable of delivering precise doses directly into the bloodstream within milliseconds of receiving neural commands. The entire system operates automatically based on biometric feedback, adjusting chemical levels to maintain optimal combat performance without requiring conscious control from the operative. Cryosuspension technology allows the Temple to maintain Eversor operatives between missions, preventing the biochemical cocktail from burning out their enhanced bodies during periods of inactivity. The suspension chambers resemble oversized sarcophagi, their interiors lined with cooling elements and life support systems that maintain the operative in a state of frozen hibernation. Temperature regulation proves critical. The chambers must cool the operative's body to temperatures that would kill normal humans, while avoiding ice crystal formation that would damage cellular structures. Specialized fluids perfuse the operative's tissues during suspension, replacing blood and other bodily fluids with cryoprotective compounds that prevent freezing damage. The suspension process begins with sedation protocols that shut down the operative's enhanced metabolism and aggressive conditioning. Tranquilizers flood the assassin system, counteracting the combat drugs and allowing the frenzon-induced rage to subside. This sedation must occur in carefully controlled conditions, as Eversor operatives in their normal state resist any attempts at restraint with lethal force. Temple personnel use specialized containment chambers where operatives can be sedated remotely, avoiding the casualties that would result from direct physical intervention. Once sedated, the operative receives the cryoprotective fluids through major blood vessels, gradually replacing their blood volume over a period of several hours. Temperature reduction proceeds in stages, with the chamber cooling the operative's body at rates carefully calculated to prevent thermal shock. Internal monitoring systems track the temperature of individual organs, ensuring uniform cooling throughout the body. The process requires approximately 8 hours from initial sedation to full suspension, with the operative's body temperature eventually reaching -40 degrees. At this temperature, metabolic processes effectively cease, placing the assassin in a state of perfect preservation. Life support systems maintain this state indefinitely, monitoring for any signs of degradation or system failure that might threaten the operative's viability. Awakening protocols reverse the suspension process, though with significantly greater speed than the initial freezing. Mission requirements typically demand rapid deployment, leaving no time for gradual reanimation. The Temple accepts the risks inherent in rapid awakening, calculating that the potential for cellular damage remains acceptable given the operative's extensive augmentation and redundant organ systems. Reanimation begins with thermal elements flooding the suspension chamber with heated fluids, raising the operative's body temperature to normal ranges within 30 minutes. Simultaneously, the cryoprotective compounds drain away and fresh blood pumps into the circulatory system, carrying the full combat drug cocktail. The moment an Eversor operative regains consciousness, they exist in a state of barely controlled rage. The frenzon and slot saturating their bloodstream eliminates any transition period between suspension and combat readiness. Temple handlers direct the awakening operative toward deployment vectors using automated systems and reinforced barriers, as direct human interaction during this phase results in immediate violence. The operatives' enhanced senses detect everything around them as potential threats, their chemically induced aggression seeking outlets for violence. Mission briefings occur during the final stages of reanimation through neural induction systems that bypass conscious thought, implanting target parameters and mission objectives directly into the operative's subconscious. The executioner pistol serves as the Eversor's primary ranged weapon, a compact yet devastating firearm designed for close-quarters combat. The weapon fires self-propelled bolt rounds similar to those employed by Space Marine bolt guns, but scaled for use in a pistol-sized package. Each round contains a miniature rocket motor that ignites after leaving the barrel, accelerating the projectile to supersonic velocities within meters of firing. The rounds detonate on impact, their mass-reactive warheads triggering when they detect the density change associated with penetrating a target. Against unarmored humans, executioner pistol rounds produce catastrophic wounds, the explosive detonation liquefying organs and severing limbs. The pistol's compact design allows Eversor operatives to wield it one-handed while employing their neuro gauntlet simultaneously, creating a devastating combination of ranged and melee capability. Magazine capacity remains limited, typically 12 rounds, but the Temple considers this acceptable given the weapon's stopping power and the operative's tendency to close to melee range rapidly. Reload mechanisms allow for magazine changes in under 2 seconds, though Eversor operatives rarely survive long enough to exhaust multiple magazines. The weapon's construction incorporates the same molecular bonding technology used in the operative's explosive collar, ensuring that it disintegrates completely following the assassin's death. The Neuro Gauntlet represents the Eversor's signature melee weapon, a powered glove that combines physical striking power with neural disruption technology. The gauntlet encases the operative's hand and forearm in articulated armor plates, each finger terminating in a razor-sharp talon constructed from ceramite and adamantium alloys. Molecular bonding along the cutting edges creates monomolecular sharpness, allowing the talons to slice through armor plating and reinforced materials with minimal resistance. The gauntlet's palm contains neural disruptor nodes that discharge on contact with targets, sending devastating electrical pulses through victims' nervous systems. Neural disruptor effects vary based on target physiology and armor protection. Against unarmored humans, contact produces immediate incapacitation as the electrical discharge overwhelms the victim's nervous system, causing every muscle to contract simultaneously. Heart stop, lungs cease function, and victims typically die within seconds of contact. Armored targets experience reduced effects as their protection grounds some of the electrical energy, though the discharge remains sufficient to cause severe pain and disorientation. The gauntlet's power supply allows for dozens of discharges before requiring recharge, more than adequate for typical mission durations, given Eversor operatives' limited life expectancy during deployment. Combat doctrine for Eversor deployment emphasizes speed and overwhelming violence. The operative deploys directly into target zones through drop pod insertion, teleportation, or similar rapid insertion methods that minimize warning time. Upon arrival, the assassin immediately engages all hostile forces without discrimination or hesitation, trusting their enhanced capabilities and chemical conditioning to overcome opposition through sheer ferocity. The Eversor moves constantly, never remaining stationary long enough for enemies to coordinate effective responses. Enhanced reaction times allow the operative to dodge incoming fire while closing distance to melee range, where the Neuro Gauntlet proves most effective. Target elimination occurs amid wholesale slaughter of anyone present in the target zone. The Eversor makes no attempt to minimize casualties or distinguish between combatants and bystanders, their mission parameters typically authorizing unlimited collateral damage. This approach serves multiple purposes beyond simple target elimination. It creates terror among enemy forces, demonstrates the futility of resisting imperial justice, and eliminates potential witnesses who might provide intelligence about Assassinorum capabilities. The psychological impact of Eversor attacks often exceeds their immediate tactical value, as survivors spread accounts of unstoppable killers who slaughtered entire compounds of defenders to reach their targets. The molecular disassembly system built into every Eversor operative ensures that capture or detailed study remains impossible, even if enemies manage to kill the assassin. This fail-safe consists of an explosive collar implanted around the operative's neck, connected to biometric sensors throughout the body. The collar monitors vital signs continuously, programmed to detonate when it detects death or when the operative consciously triggers it. The explosive yield remains relatively modest, insufficient to destroy reinforced structures, but more than adequate to completely disintegrate the operative's body, along with anyone within a 5-meter radius. The disassembly process employs specialized molecular destabilization charges rather than conventional explosives. These devices generate cascading reactions in organic matter, breaking molecular bonds and reducing biological tissues to constituent atoms within microseconds. The effect appears as a bright flash followed by complete disappearance of the operative's body, leaving no remains for analysis or recovery. Armor, weapons, and equipment undergo similar destruction through separate charges keyed to their specific materials. The entire process occurs faster than human perception can register, ensuring that even enemies who kill an Eversor operative gain no opportunity to examine the body or recover technology. Tactical applications for Eversor deployment focus on scenarios where conventional forces prove insufficient or where the Imperium desires to send unmistakable messages about the consequences of defiance. Heavily fortified positions that would require significant military resources to assault become viable targets for single Eversor operatives, who bypass defenses through speed and ferocity rather than subtlety. Chaos cult leadership compounds, Xenos command centers, and heretical government installations all fall within typical Eversor mission parameters. The temple particularly favors deploying Eversor assassins against targets surrounded by large bodyguard forces, as these situations allow the operative to demonstrate the futility of conventional security measures. Terror operations represent another category where Eversor capabilities prove valuable. The sheer horror of watching an unstoppable killer butcher dozens of defenders creates psychological impacts that persist long after the immediate threat ends. Planetary governors who witness Eversor attacks against their rivals often prove more amenable to imperial demands, their cooperation motivated by fear of suffering similar fates. Chaos warbands that encounter Eversor operatives sometimes fragment as individual leaders flee rather than risk becoming targets. The temple maintains detailed records of these secondary effects, using them to justify Eversor deployments even in situations where more subtle approaches might technically suffice. The Vindicare temple produces operatives who function as living precision instruments, assassins capable of eliminating targets from distances measured in kilometers using skills that blend superhuman patience with ballistic calculations approaching machine-level accuracy. Where other temples embrace chemical enhancement or exotic technology as their primary force multipliers, Vindicare assassins rely on training so extensive and demanding that candidates spend decades mastering their craft before the temple considers them ready for operational deployment. The philosophy underlying Vindicare doctrine holds that the perfect assassination leaves witnesses uncertain whether they witnessed murder or tragic accident, that the target should die without ever knowing danger approached, and that a single well-placed shot eliminates threats more efficiently than any amount of close-quarters violence. Recruitment for the Vindicare Temple begins with candidates who demonstrate exceptional visual acuity and hand-eye coordination during initial Assassinorum screening processes. The Temple's evaluators look for specific neurological markers that suggest aptitude for the extreme focus and patience their training demands. Candidates often come from feral world populations where survival depends on hunting skills, or from hive world environments where gang snipers develop rudimentary long-range shooting capabilities. The Temple also recruits from Imperial Guard sniper cadres, identifying soldiers who display potential beyond standard military training. Regardless of origin, all candidates share certain baseline qualities: steady hands, exceptional eyesight, and psychological profiles, suggesting they possess the temperament necessary for spending days in hostile environments waiting for single moments of opportunity. Physical conditioning for Vindicare operatives emphasizes endurance and bodily control rather than raw strength or speed. Training regimens teach candidates to regulate their heartbeat consciously, slowing their pulse to minimize the physical tremors that affect shooting accuracy. Breathing exercises derived from ancient Terran meditation practices allow operatives to enter trance-like states where respiratory function becomes so subtle that it produces no visible chest movement. Muscle control training reaches levels that seem impossible to observers unfamiliar with the Temple's methods. Vindicare assassins learn to isolate individual muscle groups, tensing or relaxing specific fibers while keeping surrounding tissues completely still. This capability proves essential for maintaining shooting positions for extended periods without cramping or involuntary movement. The Temple implants candidates with specialized cerebral augmentations that enhance their natural ballistic calculation abilities. These implants consist of additional neural processing clusters grafted onto the visual cortex and parietal lobe, creating dedicated wetware for computing trajectory calculations. The augmentations don't replace conscious thought or reduce the operative to a servitor-like state. Instead, they function as cognitive co-processors that handle the mathematical complexity of long-range shooting, while leaving the operative's consciousness free to focus on environmental assessment and timing. When a Vindicare assassin observes a target through their rifle scope, the implants automatically calculate range, wind speed, atmospheric pressure, planetary rotation, and dozens of other variables that affect projectile flight. The operative perceives these calculations as intuitive understanding rather than conscious mathematics, experiencing the knowledge of where to aim as instinctive certainty. Training in environmental adaptation occupies years of the Vindicare curriculum. Candidates deploy to hostile environments across multiple worlds, learning to survive and maintain operational effectiveness in conditions ranging from Arctic tundra to volcanic wastelands. The Temple maintains training facilities on death worlds specifically selected for their lethality, where candidates must establish concealed positions and maintain them for days or weeks while exposed to extreme temperatures, toxic atmospheres, and dangerous local fauna. Instructors evaluate candidates not merely on their survival, but on their ability to remain mission-capable throughout these ordeals. A Vindicare operative who completes environmental training can establish a sniper position in virtually any terrain, camouflaging themselves so effectively that they become effectively invisible even to sophisticated detection equipment. Camouflage techniques taught by the Temple extend far beyond simple visual concealment. Vindicare assassins learn to mask their thermal signatures using specialized equipment and positioning techniques that blend their heat output with environmental sources. They study how to minimize their electromagnetic emissions, avoiding the subtle energy signatures that auger arrays might detect. Sound discipline receives particular emphasis. Operatives practice moving in complete silence, understanding that even the faint rustle of equipment or the scrape of a boot against stone can alert security forces to their presence. The most accomplished Vindicare assassins achieve a state of environmental integration where they become part of the landscape, their presence registering to observers as natural features rather than human intruders. Meditation practices form a core component of Vindicare training. though these techniques serve purely practical purposes rather than spiritual ones. Operatives learn to enter deep meditative states that reduce their metabolic requirements, allowing them to maintain positions for days with minimal food or water. These states also provide psychological protection against the isolation and sensory deprivation inherent in long-duration observation missions. A Vindicare assassin maintaining overwatch on a target compound might spend a week lying motionless in a concealed position, their consciousness existing in a meditative state that prevents boredom or psychological deterioration, while keeping them ready to achieve full alertness within seconds when opportunity presents itself. The Exitus rifle represents the pinnacle of Imperial weapons technology applied to precision marksmanship. Each rifle requires months of handcrafting by master artificers who understand that tolerances measured in micrometers determine the difference between successful elimination and mission failure. The weapon's barrel extends nearly 2 meters in length, manufactured from exotic alloys that maintain perfect straightness despite temperature variations and the stresses of repeated firing. Rifling inside the barrel follows patterns calculated to impart ideal spin characteristics to projectiles, ensuring stable flight across extreme distances. The barrel's exterior incorporates heat dissipation systems that prevent thermal expansion from affecting accuracy, maintaining consistent point of impact regardless of how many rounds the operative fires. The rifle's action mechanism combines reliability with precision, using a bolt system that locks with tolerances tighter than those found in most spacecraft components. Each rifle undergoes individual calibration during manufacture, with artificers' test firing thousands of rounds to map the weapon's unique characteristics. These characteristics, minute variations in barrel harmonics, slight asymmetries in the action, microscopic imperfections in component interfaces, get recorded in detailed profiles that the operative studies until they understand their weapon's behavior as intimately as their own body. Vindicare assassins maintain the same rifle throughout their service, the weapon becoming an extension of themselves through years of constant use and maintenance. Optical systems mounted on Exitus rifles incorporate technology that borders on heretical in its sophistication. The primary scope provides magnification levels approaching 100 times normal vision, allowing operatives to resolve human facial features at distances exceeding 2 kilometers. Multiple reticle patterns adjust automatically based on range and environmental conditions, with the scope's internal cogitators processing data from atmospheric sensors and range-finding lasers. Thermal imaging overlays reveal targets through walls and other obstacles, while motion tracking systems highlight movement in cluttered environments. The scope interfaces directly with the operative's cerebral implants, feeding targeting data into their enhanced calculation centers and creating a seamless integration of human judgment and machine precision. Specialized ammunition types give Vindicare operatives the capability to engage targets protected by defenses that would defeat conventional sniper fire. Shield breaker rounds incorporate miniaturized disruption fields that collapse energy barriers on contact, allowing the projectile to pass through force fields that would normally deflect solid projectiles. The rounds achieve this through exotic principles that tech priests struggle to explain even to themselves, involving controlled destabilization of the electromagnetic frequencies that sustain most defensive shields. Against targets protected by conversion fields or refractor fields, shield breaker rounds prove devastatingly effective, punching through defenses that render their users effectively invulnerable to normal weapons fire. Turbo penetrator rounds address heavily armored targets, combining dense metallic cores with shaped charge principles to defeat protection that stops standard ammunition. The rounds feature adamantium penetrator tips backed by plasma, generating explosive charges that detonate microseconds after initial impact. This two-stage penetration mechanism allows turbo penetrator rounds to pierce power armor, reinforced bunker walls, and even light vehicle armor. Vindicare operatives employ these rounds against targets wearing Terminator armor or similar heavy protection, confident that their shots will reach vital organs despite multiple layers of ceramite and plasteel. The rounds prove equally effective against targets sheltering behind reinforced barriers, as the penetrator stage punches through obstacles before the plasma charge detonates inside the target. Hellfire rounds contain virulent toxins derived from Xeno's biological agents captured during Imperial military campaigns. The Officio Assassinorum maintains stocks of these alien compounds despite their heretical nature, reasoning that their effectiveness against certain targets justifies the risk of possessing Xeno's materials. Upon impact, Hellfire rounds inject their toxic payload directly into the target's bloodstream, where the compounds cause rapid cellular breakdown and catastrophic organ failure. The toxins prove particularly effective against targets with enhanced constitutions or regenerative capabilities, as the alien biochemistry overwhelms even augmented immune systems. Vindicare operatives reserve Hellfire rounds for targets whose resilience makes them difficult to eliminate through purely physical damage, Chaos champions sustained by warp energies, Orc warbosses whose massive physiology allows them to survive normally fatal wounds, or Xeno's commanders whose biology differs radically from human norms. Exodus pistols provide Vindicare operatives with close-range capability when circumstances prevent rifle use, or when missions require the assassin to engage targets at distances measured in meters rather than kilometers. The pistols fire the same specialized ammunition as their rifle counterparts, though with reduced muzzle velocity and effective range. Despite these limitations, Exodus pistols remain formidable weapons capable of eliminating most targets with single shots. The pistols incorporate sound suppression systems that reduce firing signatures to barely audible whispers, allowing operatives to engage targets in close proximity to security forces without immediately alerting nearby guards. Vindicare assassins train extensively with pistols despite their primary focus on rifle marksmanship, understanding that missions sometimes require adaptability when carefully laid plans encounter unexpected complications. Ballistic calculation represents perhaps the most demanding aspect of Vindicare training, requiring operatives to account for variables that most shooters never consider. Planetary rotation affects projectile flight over extreme distances, as the target moves laterally relative to the shooter during the bullet's time of flight. On worlds with rapid rotation periods, this effect becomes pronounced enough that failing to compensate results in complete misses despite otherwise perfect aim. Vindicare operatives learn to calculate these effects instinctively, their enhanced neural implants processing planetary data and adjusting their aim point accordingly. The calculations become more complex when engaging targets on different elevation levels, as altitude differences introduce additional variables related to atmospheric density and gravitational variations. Wind compensation demands constant attention throughout the entire flight path between shooter and target. Wind rarely blows consistently. It gusts, swirls around obstacles, and varies with altitude in ways that create turbulent corridors through which projectiles must travel. Vindicare training teaches operatives to read environmental indicators that reveal wind patterns, the movement of vegetation, dust patterns in the air, the behavior of smoke or steam from industrial facilities. Advanced practitioners develop almost supernatural ability to predict wind behavior, observing conditions at their firing position and extrapolating wind patterns across kilometers of intervening space. The most challenging shots involve targets in urban environments where wind patterns become chaotic due to building-generated turbulence, requiring operatives to time their shots for momentary windows when conditions align favorably. Temperature gradients between the shooter's position and the target create optical distortions that affect aim point calculations. Hot air rising from sun-heated surfaces bends light in predictable but complex patterns, causing targets to appear slightly displaced from their actual positions. Vindicare operatives learn to recognize these mirages and compensate for them, understanding that shooting at the visible target position results in misses. Cold environments present different challenges, as dense cold air affects projectile velocity and trajectory in ways that differ from warmer conditions. Operatives maintain mental databases of ballistic performance across temperature ranges, automatically adjusting their calculations based on current conditions. The humidity level affects projectile flight through its influence on air density and the behavior of propellant gases. Moisture-saturated air provides more resistance to projectile movement than dry air, requiring slight adjustments to elevation to maintain accuracy. Vindicare training includes extensive practice in diverse atmospheric conditions, building the experience necessary to make these adjustments automatically. Operatives deployed to water worlds or jungle environments must account for near-saturation humidity levels, while those operating in desert or void station environments deal with extremely dry conditions that affect their calculations differently. Famous Vindicare operations span the Imperium's history, though most remain classified within Assassinorum archives. The decapitation strike against Snagrod during the Badab War demonstrated Vindicare capabilities against Xeno's leadership targets in chaotic combat environments. Snagrod, an orc warlord whose forces had devastated multiple Imperial worlds, maintained security protocols that made conventional assassination approaches nearly impossible. The warboss surrounded himself with hundreds of elite orc bodyguards and employed crude but effective counter-sniper tactics learned through decades of warfare. A Vindicare operative deployed to the war zone spent 3 weeks conducting reconnaissance, studying Snagrod's movements, and identifying patterns in his security arrangements. The operative established a firing position in the ruins of a destroyed manufactorum complex, concealing himself among rubble nearly 4 kilometers from Snagrod's command compound. The distance exceeded normal engagement ranges, even for Vindicare standards, but the operative calculated that closer positions offered insufficient concealment given orc security patrols. The assassin remained in position for 6 days, motionless except for minimal movements necessary to prevent muscle atrophy and maintain bodily functions. Orc patrols passed within meters of his hide site multiple times, the Xenos failing to detect the perfectly camouflaged human despite their keen senses. Opportunity presented itself when Snagrod emerged from his compound to observe a gladiatorial combat between rival orc mobs. The warboss stood on an elevated platform surrounded by his bodyguards, presenting a target window lasting approximately 8 seconds. The Vindicare operative fired a single turbo-penetrator round, the shot accounting for extreme range, crosswind conditions, and the movement of both shooter and target due to the planet's rotation. The round struck Snagrod in the head, penetrating his thick skull and destroying his brain despite the orc's massive size and resilience. The warboss died instantly, his body collapsing before his bodyguards registered the distant crack of the rifle shot. The WA fragmented within days as rival orc leaders fought for supremacy, allowing Imperial forces to defeat the Xenos in detail rather than facing them as a unified threat. Chaos cult leadership represents another target category where Vindicare capabilities prove essential. These individuals typically operate from concealed locations, surrounding themselves with fanatical followers willing to die protecting their masters. Conventional military operations against cult compounds often result in high Imperial casualties and risk allowing cult leaders to escape through prepared evacuation routes. Vindicare operatives eliminate this problem through patient observation and precisely timed shots that kill cult leaders before their followers realize danger exists. One documented operation involved a cult on the hive world of Persephia, where a charismatic preacher had converted thousands of citizens to chaos worship through a combination of rhetoric and subtle warp influence. The cult leader maintained a heavily fortified position in the hive's mid-levels, protected by layers of security that included both human guards and demonically possessed sentries. A Vindicare operative infiltrated the hive weeks before the planned strike, establishing multiple observation posts that allowed comprehensive surveillance of the cult's activities. The assassin identified the cult leader's daily routine, noting that the heretic briefly appeared at a specific window each morning to observe his growing congregation. The window opening lasted less than 5 seconds, and the cult leader stood partially concealed behind structural elements that blocked most potential firing angles. The operative selected a firing position in an abandoned hab unit 3 kilometers distant, calculating that the extreme range combined with the difficult angle provided the only viable shot. Environmental conditions complicated the engagement. Atmospheric processors in the hive created turbulent air currents that varied unpredictably throughout the day. The assassin studied these patterns for a week, identifying a brief period each morning when the turbulence subsided enough to permit accurate fire. On the designated day, the operative fired a shield breaker round during the narrow window when both environmental conditions and target exposure aligned. The round penetrated the cult leader's protective wards and struck him through the eye, killing him instantly. The cult collapsed within hours as members turned on each other without their leader's unifying presence, allowing Arbites forces to conduct purges that eliminated the heretical organization before it could threaten the broader hive population. Vindicare operatives occasionally deploy against targets that require elimination for political rather than purely military reasons. Corrupt imperial officials who have betrayed their oaths but maintain sufficient influence to avoid conventional prosecution sometimes find themselves designated for Vindicare attention. These operations demand particular discretion, as the Imperium prefers to avoid public acknowledgement that it assassinates its own officials. Vindicare assassins eliminate such targets in ways that appear as accidents or natural causes, using specialized ammunition that leaves minimal forensic evidence. A shot through a window might appear as equipment failure that caused explosive decompression. A round that triggers existing medical conditions creates the impression of death by natural causes. The temple trains operatives extensively in these techniques, understanding that maintaining the Imperium's political stability sometimes requires removing problematic individuals without creating martyrs or triggering succession crises. The Venom Temple operates from facilities so thoroughly concealed that even most High Lords of Terra cannot identify their locations. Unlike the other temples whose headquarters occupy known positions within the Assassinorum's Terra-based infrastructure, Venom maintains its primary laboratories and training centers in locations distributed across multiple worlds, each facility operating under cover identities that disguise their true purpose. This decentralization serves practical purposes beyond mere security. The temple's work with exotic toxins and biological agents requires isolation protocols that prevent contamination of surrounding populations. A single containment failure in a Venom laboratory could sterilize entire hive levels or render planetary sectors uninhabitable for generations, making remote locations essential rather than optional. The temple's doctrine centers on a fundamental truth that most imperial citizens prefer to ignore. Every living thing possesses vulnerabilities to chemical or biological attack, regardless of physical protection or combat capability. A space marine in full power armor remains impervious to most conventional weapons, but his enhanced physiology still requires oxygen, still processes nutrients through biological systems, still relies on chemical processes that can be disrupted or subverted. The Venom Temple catalogs these vulnerabilities with obsessive thoroughness, maintaining archives that document the biochemical weaknesses of thousands of species, subspecies, and genetically modified variants encountered across the galaxy. These archives represent millennia of accumulated knowledge, combining captured Xenos biological data with observations from countless assassination operations and extensive laboratory experimentation. Recruitment for the Venom Temple draws heavily from the Adeptus Biologists, identifying tech adepts and biologist savants who demonstrate both the technical expertise necessary for advanced toxicology and the moral flexibility required for weaponizing their knowledge. The temple also recruits from death worlds, where indigenous populations develop sophisticated understanding of natural poisons through necessity, societies where survival depends on extracting toxins from local flora and fauna for use in hunting and tribal warfare. These recruits bring practical knowledge that complements the theoretical understanding provided by formally trained biologist adepts, creating a synthesis of academic rigor and empirical experience. Training begins with comprehensive education in biochemistry, molecular biology, and xenobiology that rivals the instruction provided by the Magos biologists themselves. Candidates study cellular metabolism across dozens of species, learning to identify the specific enzymatic pathways and receptor systems that govern biological function. They memorize the molecular structures of thousands of compounds, understanding how slight variations in chemical composition produce dramatically different physiological effects. Advanced coursework covers genetic manipulation techniques, teaching operatives how to modify existing toxins or engineer entirely new compounds tailored to specific targets. The curriculum demands intellectual capabilities far exceeding those required by other temples. Venom operatives function as much as research scientists as assassins, their missions often requiring them to synthesize custom poisons based on intelligence about target physiology gathered during reconnaissance phases. The temple's laboratories contain equipment and specimens that would horrify even hardened inquisitors. Containment chambers house living examples of Xenos species captured specifically for toxicological research, their bodies subjected to systematic testing of various compounds to map their biochemical vulnerabilities. Venom researchers maintain cultures of bacteria and viruses harvested from plague worlds, death worlds, and even chaos-corrupted systems, where diseases mutate into forms that defy natural classification. Synthesis facilities produce compounds so lethal that single molecules prove sufficient to kill unprotected humans, requiring manipulation through remote-controlled servitor systems operating behind multiple layers of containment barriers. Storage vaults contain samples of every toxin the temple has ever created or encountered, each specimen preserved in stasis fields and protected by security measures that rival those guarding the most sacred imperial relics. Molecular engineering represents the cutting edge of venom capabilities, allowing operatives to design toxins optimized for specific targets. The process begins with detailed analysis of the target's biology, blood samples, when available, genetic material recovered from hair or skin cells, or even detailed medical records obtained through intelligence operations. Venom researchers use this information to construct molecular models of the target's cellular receptors, enzymatic systems, and metabolic pathways. They then design toxin molecules shaped to interact with these specific biological features, creating compounds that prove devastatingly effective against the intended target, while potentially showing reduced toxicity toward different physiologies. This specificity provides operational advantages beyond simple lethality. A poison engineered to kill a particular orc warboss might prove relatively harmless to the human population living in the same region, allowing the temple to eliminate Xenos leadership without triggering ecological disasters or mass civilian casualties. Delivery mechanisms vary enormously depending on mission parameters and target characteristics. Atmospheric dispersal serves for targets who can be isolated in enclosed spaces. A poison introduced into a building's ventilation system reaches everyone inside within minutes, killing or incapacitating them before they realize danger exists. Venom operatives engineer aerosol toxins that remain suspended in air for extended periods, ensuring complete coverage throughout target zones. The compounds often include delayed action components that prevent immediate symptoms, allowing the poison to spread throughout the target system before effects become apparent. By the time victims realize they have been poisoned, their bodies already contain lethal doses that no medical intervention can counter. Water supply contamination offers another vector for targets who rely on centralized resource distribution. Venom toxins designed for aqueous delivery remain stable in water for days or weeks, surviving filtration systems and purification treatments that eliminate conventional poisons. The temple engineers these compounds to resist detection through standard testing protocols, their molecular structures mimicking harmless organic compounds until they enter living tissues. A venom operative might contaminate a planetary governor's private water supply weeks before the poison activates, creating the appearance of death by natural causes long after the assassin has departed the target world. Food poisoning represents perhaps the most traditional delivery method, though venom approaches bear little resemblance to crude attempts at introducing toxins into meals. Temple operatives create compounds that remain completely tasteless and odorless even to enhance senses, that survive cooking temperatures that would destroy conventional poisons, and that produce no detectable changes in food appearance or texture. Some toxins require ingestion of multiple doses over extended periods before achieving lethal concentrations, allowing operatives to poison targets through their regular diet without triggering suspicion. Others work through cumulative damage to specific organs, creating conditions that appear as natural disease progression rather than deliberate poisoning. Contact poisons eliminate targets through skin absorption, requiring no ingestion or inhalation. Venom researchers engineer these compounds with molecular structures that allow them to penetrate the skin's natural barriers, passing through the stratum corneum and entering the bloodstream directly. The most sophisticated contact poisons work through single-molecule exposure. A target who merely touches a treated surface absorbs sufficient toxin to guarantee death within hours or days. Venom operatives apply these substances to objects the target handles regularly: door handles, data slate surfaces, weapon grips, or ceremonial items. The poisons often include time delay mechanisms that prevent immediate effects, allowing the operative to establish alibis or evacuate the target area before symptoms manifest. Injection delivery provides the most reliable method for ensuring lethal doses reach target bloodstreams, though it requires closer proximity than other techniques. Venom operatives employ various injection mechanisms depending on circumstances: traditional needles for targets who can be approached during medical procedures or intimate situations, pneumatic injectors that penetrate clothing and skin from short distances, or even modified insects bioengineered to serve as living syringes. The Temple maintains extensive research programs focused on creating injection systems that leave no detectable marks, understanding that autopsy examination might reveal evidence of foul play if injection sites remain visible. Some venom toxins cause tissue reactions that obscure injection points, creating inflammatory responses that disguise the original wound. Others trigger cellular breakdown that destroys evidence of penetration before medical examiners can conduct their investigations. Biological warfare agents represent the most extreme category of venom weapons, reserved for situations where the Imperium requires elimination of entire populations rather than individual targets. The Temple maintains stocks of engineered plagues capable of sterilizing hive levels, rendering agricultural worlds barren, or eliminating specific genetic populations while leaving others unaffected. These weapons exist in a legal gray area even within the Assassinorum's classified operations. Their use requires authorization from multiple High Lords and typically occurs only when conventional military options prove impractical or when political considerations demand deniability. Venom researchers design these agents with specific transmission characteristics, infectivity rates, and mortality curves calculated to achieve strategic objectives. A plague engineered to eliminate a rebellious hive world population might feature high infectivity, but delayed symptom onset, allowing the disease to spread throughout the target population before anyone realizes an outbreak has begun. Antidotes and countermeasures receive equal attention in venom research programs, as operatives must protect themselves from accidental exposure to the compounds they deploy. The Temple engineers most toxins with built-in molecular switches that render them harmless when specific counter-agents are present in the bloodstream. Operatives receive inoculations before missions, their bodies loaded with these counter-agents at concentrations sufficient to neutralize any poison they might encounter during operations. The antidotes themselves often prove as dangerous as the toxins they counter, producing side effects that range from mild discomfort to temporary organ dysfunction. Venom operatives accept these risks as necessary costs of their profession, understanding that death by accidental poisoning represents an occupational hazard inherent to their work. The Temple Vanus operates from a philosophical position that information represents the ultimate weapon, that controlling what people know or think they know provides power exceeding any physical force. Where other temples eliminate targets through direct violence or poison, Vanus assassins kill through manipulation of data streams, administrative systems, and the vast bureaucratic apparatus that sustains the Imperium. A Vanus operative might never physically approach their target, instead orchestrating the victim's death through carefully crafted sequences of falsified orders, redirected resources, and manipulated information that create circumstances where the target's own allies eliminate them. The Temple's doctrine holds that the most perfect assassination leaves no evidence that assassination occurred, that the target's death appears as natural consequence of their own actions or the predictable functioning of imperial systems. Cyber assassination represents the Vanus Temple's most distinctive capability, requiring operatives who combine the technical expertise of tech priests with the strategic thinking of military commanders and the psychological insight of inquisitorial interrogators. Vanus training produces individuals who understand the Imperium's information infrastructure at levels exceeding most Mechanicus adepts, who can navigate data networks spanning multiple sectors, and who possess the creativity necessary to weaponize administrative processes against designated targets. The training emphasizes systems thinking, teaching operatives to perceive the complex webs of dependencies, authorities, and information flows that connect imperial institutions. A Vanus assassin views the Imperium not as a political entity, but as an enormous machine whose components can be manipulated to produce desired outcomes. Recruitment draws from multiple sources, each providing different skill sets that contribute to Vanus capabilities. The Temple actively recruits from the Administratum's upper ranks, identifying clerks and data analysts who demonstrate both exceptional competence and the moral flexibility necessary for assassination work. These individuals bring intimate knowledge of imperial bureaucratic procedures, understanding which forms must be filed, which authorities must approve specific actions, and how to forge documentation that passes even careful scrutiny. Tech priests who show aptitude for data manipulation rather than purely mechanical work receive recruitment offers, their technical skills providing the foundation for cyber warfare operations. The Temple even recruits from criminal organizations, particularly those specializing in forgery and identity theft, recognizing that these individuals possess practical experience with document falsification that formal training cannot replicate. Training facilities for Vanus operatives bear little resemblance to the combat-focused installations maintained by other temples. Vanus candidates spend years studying in environments that resemble Administratum archive complexes more than military bases, surrounded by data terminals, document fabrication equipment, and elaborate mock-ups of imperial bureaucratic systems. They practice forging requisition orders, medical records, military deployment schedules, and countless other document types that form the Imperium's administrative foundation. Advanced training involves penetrating secure data networks, learning to bypass security protocols and access restricted information without triggering alarms that would alert system administrators. Operatives study the specific quirks and vulnerabilities of different data network architectures, understanding that systems developed on Mars function differently from those created by local tech priests on distant Forge worlds. The manipulation of imperial bureaucracy provides Vanus operatives with assassination capabilities that operate entirely within legal frameworks. A target planetary governor might find himself suddenly transferred to a Death World garrison through orders that appear to originate from the Adeptus Munitorum's highest authorities. The forged transfer orders include all proper authorization codes, bear the correct seals, and reference legitimate regulation passages that justify the transfer. The governor's protests get lost in administrative channels, his appeals routed to offices that don't exist or that refer him to other departments in endless bureaucratic circles. He arrives at his new assignment to discover conditions far more dangerous than his previous posting, and his death in combat or through environmental hazards appears as tragic but unremarkable consequence of military service. The Vannis operative who orchestrated this outcome never physically approached the target, never deployed weapons or poisons, and left no evidence of assassination beyond perfectly legitimate administrative documents. Economic manipulation eliminates targets through financial destruction that leads to predictable consequences. Vannis operatives infiltrate banking systems and trade networks, subtly altering records to make targets appear as embezzlers or heretics who have violated commercial regulations. A merchant prince targeted for elimination might discover his accounts frozen, his trade licenses revoked, and his reputation destroyed through carefully planted evidence of illegal activities. His business partners abandon him, his creditors demand immediate payment of debts, and his rivals move to absorb his commercial holdings. The target faces financial ruin that often leads to suicide or makes him vulnerable to elimination by mundane criminals seeking to collect debts. The Vannis operative orchestrates this collapse through hundreds of small data alterations across multiple systems, each change appearing as routine correction of clerical errors or legitimate enforcement of commercial regulations. Supply chain disruption provides another vector for eliminating targets without direct confrontation. A Vannis assassin might manipulate logistics networks to ensure that a target military unit receives no ammunition resupply before engaging enemy forces, or that a target space station's life support consumables fail to arrive before existing stocks deplete. The manipulation occurs through alterations to shipping manifests, routing changes that redirect supplies to wrong destinations, and forged communications that create confusion among logistics personnel. The target unit enters combat without adequate ammunition and suffers catastrophic casualties, or the space station's population dies from oxygen depletion, outcomes that appear as tragic logistics failures rather than deliberate assassination. Investigations reveal nothing but bureaucratic incompetence and communication errors, exactly the sort of mundane problems that plague the Imperium's vast administrative apparatus constantly. Information warfare operations target the networks and communication systems that coordinate enemy activities. Vannis operatives penetrate hostile data networks, introducing subtle corruptions that degrade enemy capabilities without triggering obvious alarms. They might alter targeting data used by enemy artillery, causing bombardments to strike wrong coordinates. They could manipulate supply databases to create artificial shortages that force enemy commanders to make poor strategic decisions. Communication intercepts get altered before reaching their intended recipients, creating confusion and mistrust among enemy leadership. These operations require intimate understanding of enemy systems and the creativity to identify vulnerabilities that can be exploited without detection. A successful Vannis information warfare campaign leaves enemies unable to trust their own data, second-guessing every report and order while the operative remains completely invisible. The Temple maintains extensive databases documenting the Imperium's administrative systems, updated constantly as new regulations emerge and existing procedures evolve. These databases include detailed information about authorization hierarchies, document formats, security protocols, and the countless other details that govern how the Imperium's bureaucracy functions. Vannis operatives study these databases obsessively, memorizing the specific requirements for different types of administrative actions. They learn which officials possess authority to approve various orders, how to forge their signatures and seals, and which communication channels must be used for different types of directives. The knowledge proves essential for creating forgeries that withstand scrutiny. A single incorrect detail in a forged document might trigger investigations that unravel entire operations. Vannis operatives deployed to active war zones function as force multipliers who enhance conventional military effectiveness through information superiority. They penetrate enemy communication networks, providing Imperial commanders with intelligence about enemy dispositions, intentions, and capabilities. They manipulate enemy data systems to create false intelligence that leads enemy forces into ambushes or causes them to abandon defensible positions. Some operations involve impersonating enemy commanders through compromised communication channels, issuing orders that create confusion or trigger friendly fire incidents. The Temple considers these activities as forms of assassination, eliminating enemy combat effectiveness through information manipulation rather than physical destruction. The Officio Assassinorum occupies a unique position within the Imperium's institutional hierarchy, operating with autonomy that most imperial organizations cannot claim, while simultaneously remaining subject to oversight mechanisms designed to prevent the abuse of its lethal capabilities. The organization answers directly to the Senatorum Imperialis, the Council of High Lords who govern the Imperium in the Emperor's name, yet maintains operational independence that allows it to function without constant supervision or approval for routine missions. This arrangement reflects careful balance between the need for centralized control over assassination capabilities and the practical requirement for operational flexibility. The High Lords recognize that effective use of precision elimination requires allowing the Assassinorum's leadership to make tactical decisions without bureaucratic delays that might compromise time-sensitive operations. The Grand Master of Assassins holds one of the 12 seats among the High Lords of Terra, though this position operates differently from most other High Lord appointments. Where positions like the Master of the Administratum or the Fabricator General of Mars represent permanent fixtures in the Senatorum's composition, the Grand Master's seat exists as a rotating position that appears on the High Lords' Council only when circumstances warrant direct Assassinorum representation. Historical precedent established during the immediate post-heresy period determines when the Grand Master receives appointment to the High Lords, typically during periods of significant internal threat, widespread heresy, or when the Imperium faces enemies that require surgical elimination rather than conventional military response. The current era, with its proliferation of chaos cults, Xenos incursions, and internal corruption, has seen the Grand Master maintain near-permanent representation among the High Lords for the past several millennia. Selection of the Grand Master follows protocols established by Malcador the Sigillite during the organization's founding, though modified over millennia to account for changing circumstances. The position requires unanimous approval from the Temple Masters, who lead the individual assassination clades, ensuring that no single temple dominates the organization's highest office. Candidates typically emerge from the ranks of Temple Masters themselves, individuals who have demonstrated both operational excellence during their years as active assassins and administrative competence during their subsequent leadership of temple facilities and training programs. The selection process involves extensive evaluation of candidates' strategic thinking, political acumen, and ability to balance the competing interests of different temples while maintaining the organization's overall effectiveness. The Grand Master wields authority that extends across all temple operations, though the degree of control varies based on operational circumstances and temple autonomy traditions. Strategic decisions regarding target selection, resource allocation between temples, and coordination with other imperial institutions fall entirely within the Grand Master's purview. The office maintains direct communication channels with the Inquisition, the Adeptus Custodes, and other organizations whose activities intersect with Assassinorum operations. During periods when the Grand Master holds a High Lord seat, this individual participates in discussions and decisions affecting the entire Imperium, bringing perspectives shaped by intimate knowledge of the threats that conventional military forces cannot address effectively. Political power wielded by the Grand Master derives not from military forces or economic resources, but from control over capabilities that other High Lords sometimes require for their own purposes. A High Lord facing opposition from rivals within the Senatorum might request Assassinorum intervention to eliminate problematic individuals, though strict protocols govern such requests to prevent the office from becoming a tool of personal ambition. The Grand Master must balance these political pressures against the organization's primary mission of eliminating threats to the Imperium as a whole. Refusing requests from powerful High Lords risks creating enemies who might work to undermine the Assassinorum's autonomy, while acceding to every request transforms the organization into an instrument of internal political warfare rather than a defensive asset. The relationship between the Officio Assassinorum and the Holy Ordos of the Inquisition represents one of the Imperium's most complex institutional interactions, characterized by cooperation, competition, and occasional conflict. Both organizations operate in shadows, pursuing enemies that threaten the Imperium from within and without. Both maintain extensive intelligence networks that span the galaxy, gathering information about heretics, xenos, and other threats. Both possess authority to eliminate Imperial citizens without trial or formal charges when circumstances demand immediate action. These similarities create natural points of intersection where Inquisitors and Assassinorum operatives find themselves pursuing related objectives, sometimes in the same locations and targeting the same individuals. Cooperation protocols establish frameworks for joint operations when inquisitorial investigations identify targets requiring elimination. An Inquisitor who uncovers a chaos cult might request Assassinorum support for eliminating the cult's leadership, recognizing that precision strikes prove more effective than military assaults that risk allowing key figures to escape. The request travels through established channels, typically beginning with the Inquisitor submitting detailed intelligence to their Ordo's leadership, who then forward the request to the Grand Master's office with supporting documentation justifying the need for assassination rather than conventional investigation and prosecution. The Grand Master's staff evaluates these requests based on multiple criteria: the threat level posed by the target, the likelihood of successful elimination, potential complications that might arise from the operation, and whether the requested action aligns with broader Assassinorum priorities. Approved operations typically involve the Inquisitor providing intelligence support, while Assassinorum operatives conduct the actual elimination. The Inquisitor's resources, informant networks, surveillance capabilities, and authority to requisition Imperial military assets complement the Assassinorum's specialized killing capabilities. An Inquisitor might establish surveillance on a target compound, mapping security arrangements and identifying optimal approach vectors for an assassin. They could manipulate local authorities to create distractions that draw security forces away from the target at crucial moments. Some Inquisitors personally accompany assassination operations, though this practice remains controversial within both organizations due to the operational security risks and the potential for inquisitorial interference with temple methodologies. Jurisdictional conflicts arise when both organizations pursue the same targets through different approaches, or when philosophical disagreements about proper threat response create friction. Inquisitors often prefer capturing targets alive for interrogation, believing that the intelligence gained through questioning outweighs the certainty of immediate elimination. The Assassinorum's doctrine emphasizes permanent removal of threats, viewing capture operations as unnecessarily risky and potentially allowing dangerous individuals opportunities to escape or deploy contingency measures. These competing priorities sometimes result in situations where Inquisitors and Assassins literally race to reach targets first, each organization determined to handle the threat according to their own methodology. The months of shame following the First War for Armageddon exemplified the tensions that can emerge between these organizations. Inquisitor Lord Gesme Cisneros of the Ordo Malleus sought to eliminate all witnesses to the demonic incursion that had occurred on Armageddon, including Space Marines of the Space Wolves chapter who had fought against the demonic forces. The Inquisitor requested Assassinorum support for eliminating specific Space Wolves who refused mind-wiping or execution, believing their knowledge of chaos represented unacceptable security risks. The Grand Master of Assassins at that time declined the request, judging that deploying assassins against loyalist Space Marines who had defended the Imperium heroically would undermine the Assassinorum's legitimacy and potentially trigger conflicts with other Space Marine chapters. This refusal contributed to the broader crisis that nearly erupted into open warfare between the Inquisition and the Space Wolves, demonstrating how Assassinorum decisions to decline missions can have significant political ramifications. Joint operations against threats requiring both investigation and elimination demonstrate the potential effectiveness of Inquisition-Assassinorum cooperation when both organizations align their objectives properly. Genestealer cult infiltrations represent ideal targets for combined operations, as the cult's distributed nature and psychic coordination make them difficult for either organization to eliminate independently. An inquisitor investigating cult activities can identify the patriarch's location and the cult's organizational structure through interrogation of captured cultists and analysis of their activities. This intelligence allows the Assassinorum to deploy operatives, typically Callidus assassins, whose polymorphine abilities let them infiltrate cult gatherings, to eliminate the patriarch and key cult leaders in coordinated strikes. The cult's collapse following leadership elimination enables the Inquisitor to conduct thorough purges of remaining cultists without facing organized resistance. Operations against chaos cults benefit similarly from combined approaches. Inquisitors excel at identifying cult members hidden within Imperial society, tracing the networks of corruption that connect seemingly loyal citizens to heretical organizations. The Assassinorum eliminates cult leadership before they can trigger uprisings or summon demonic entities, while the Inquisitor's forces handle the subsequent investigation and purge of cult membership. The timing of these operations requires careful coordination. Striking too early might miss key cult figures who have not yet revealed themselves, while waiting too long risks allowing the cult to grow beyond the point where surgical elimination of leadership proves sufficient. Training facilities on Terra form the core of the Assassinorum's institutional infrastructure, though the exact locations of these installations remain among the Imperium's most closely guarded secrets. The facilities occupy spaces deep beneath the Imperial Palace and surrounding regions, connected by tunnels that predate the current palace structure. Some sections incorporate architecture from the Age of Strife or even earlier periods, their construction methods and materials impossible to replicate with current Imperial technology. The temple complexes exist as self-contained environments where recruits spend years or decades without ever seeing natural sunlight or breathing unfiltered air. Each temple maintains its own distinct facilities, physically separated from other temple installations to maintain operational security and preserve the specialized knowledge that defines each clade's unique capabilities. The Callidus Temple's Terra-based facilities include extensive medical laboratories where polymorphine synthesis occurs under conditions of absolute security. The laboratories occupy chambers carved from solid bedrock hundreds of meters below the surface, their walls lined with containment systems designed to prevent any polymorphine from escaping into the surrounding environment. Tech priests sworn to eternal secrecy maintain the synthesis equipment, their knowledge of polymorphine production making them as valuable as the substance itself. Training chambers within the Callidus complex include hololithic projection systems that create realistic simulations of target environments, allowing operatives to practice infiltration scenarios against virtual security systems and personnel. The temple maintains extensive costume and equipment storage, housing garments and accessories representing thousands of different Imperial cultures and social roles that operatives might need to assume during missions. Vindicare facilities emphasize long-range training environments that replicate the extreme distances at which temple operatives engage targets. The temple maintains firing ranges extending for kilometers through ancient tunnel systems, their lengths allowing operatives to practice shots that account for all the variables affecting extreme range marksmanship. Environmental simulation chambers recreate atmospheric conditions from across the Imperium, the thin air of high-altitude positions, the dense humidity of jungle worlds, the temperature extremes of ice planets and desert wastes. Operatives spend months in these chambers, learning to compensate for environmental factors through repeated practice until the adjustments become instinctive. Weapons workshops produce and maintain the Exodus rifles that represent the pinnacle of Imperial marksmanship technology, each rifle receiving individual attention from master artificers who understand that microscopic imperfections determine the difference between mission success and failure. The Eversor Temple's Terra installations include cryo-suspension facilities housing dozens of operatives maintained in frozen stasis between deployments. The suspension chambers occupy reinforced vaults designed to contain the operatives should they somehow awaken prematurely, a scenario that would result in immediate violence as the combat drugs flooding their systems eliminate any capacity for rational thought. Medical facilities within the Eversor complex perform the extensive surgical modifications that transform recruits into living weapons, their operating theaters equipped with life support systems capable of maintaining patients through procedures that would kill unmodified humans through shock alone. Chemical synthesis laboratories produce the specialized combat drug cocktails that define Eversor capabilities, their output carefully measured and stored in armored containers that prevent unauthorized access or accidental release. Culexus facilities exist in the most isolated sections of the Terra-based complex, separated from other temple installations by physical distance and psychic shielding that contains the disturbing presence of the operatives housed within. The temple maintains its training chambers in areas where the walls themselves incorporate psychically resistant materials, creating dead zones where even powerful psychers find their abilities completely suppressed. These chambers serve double duty as containment areas and training environments, allowing Culexus operatives to practice focusing their anti-psychic effects without disturbing personnel in surrounding areas. The Animus Speculum helmets that serve as the temple's signature weapons undergo construction and calibration in workshops where tech priests work alongside blanks whose presence they find profoundly disturbing, their dedication to the Omnissiah overcoming their instinctive revulsion. Classified temple strongholds throughout the Imperium provide forward operating bases and regional training facilities that reduce the need for all operations to deploy directly from Terra. These installations occupy locations selected for their isolation and defensive advantages: remote moons orbiting gas giants in uninhabited systems, asteroid facilities in regions far from major shipping lanes, underground complexes on death worlds whose hostile environments discourage unauthorized visitors. Each stronghold maintains stocks of specialized equipment, weapons, and other resources necessary for temple operations in their respective regions. The installations also serve as safe houses where operatives can recover between missions, undergo medical treatment for injuries sustained during operations, or receive additional training in specialized techniques required for upcoming assignments. The strongholds operate under cover identities that disguise their true purpose from local Imperial authorities and potential enemies. A Vindicare facility might present itself as a remote Mechanicus research station studying atmospheric phenomena, its legitimate scientific activities providing cover for the sniper ranges and observation posts that serve the temple's actual purposes. Callidus installations often masquerade as administratum archive facilities or minor schola progenium institutions, their legitimate administrative or educational functions explaining the presence of personnel and the security measures protecting the facilities. These cover identities require constant maintenance, with temple personnel actually performing the duties associated with their false roles to maintain authenticity should Imperial authorities conduct inspections or investigations. Execution force deployment procedures activate when the Imperium faces threats requiring coordinated application of multiple assassination methodologies. These rare operations bring together operatives from different temples, combining their specialized capabilities to eliminate targets that single temple approaches cannot handle effectively. The authorization process for execution force deployment requires approval from both the Grand Master of Assassins and at least 3 other High Lords, reflecting the significant resources committed to these operations and the strategic importance of their targets. Historical precedent establishes that execution force deployment typically occurs against chaos champions, whose powers make them effectively invulnerable to conventional military assault, Xenos leaders whose elimination would cripple enemy war efforts, or heretical Imperial officials whose positions provide them with defenses that single assassins cannot overcome. The composition of an execution force varies based on target characteristics and mission requirements, though the standard formation includes one operative from each of the 4 primary temples. A Vindicare assassin provides long-range fire support and eliminates targets of opportunity during approach phases. The Callidus operative infiltrates target defenses using polymorphine to assume trusted identities, gathering intelligence, and creating opportunities for other team members. An Eversor assassin serves as the primary assault element, their overwhelming violence drawing enemy attention and eliminating large numbers of defenders. The Culexus operative targets psychers and demonic entities whose warp-based powers would otherwise threaten the team's success. This combination of capabilities creates a force capable of overcoming defenses that would stop conventional military units or individual assassins operating alone. Coordination between operatives from different temples presents significant challenges, as each clade's training emphasizes individual operation and temple-specific methodologies that don't naturally integrate with other approaches. Execution force operatives receive specialized training in joint operations, learning to coordinate their actions despite their different tactical philosophies and combat styles. Communication protocols establish how team members share intelligence and coordinate timing without compromising operational security. The training emphasizes flexibility, teaching operatives to adapt their standard approaches when working alongside assassins whose methods differ radically from their own. A Vindicare sniper accustomed to operating alone from concealed positions must learn to provide overwatch for Eversor operatives, whose aggressive assaults create dynamic tactical situations requiring rapid target prioritization decisions. Deployment typically occurs through specialized transport assets controlled directly by the Grand Master's office rather than requisitioned from Imperial military forces. These vessels incorporate stealth technologies and defensive systems that allow them to penetrate hostile territory without detection, delivering the execution force to insertion points near their targets. The ships themselves represent significant investments of resources and technology, their capabilities exceeding those of standard Imperial military transports. Some incorporate Xenos-derived stealth systems, whose use technically violates Imperial law, but receives tacit approval given the critical nature of execution force missions. The crews manning these vessels undergo memory conditioning after each mission, ensuring that knowledge of Assassinorum capabilities and deployment methods cannot leak to potential enemies. The success rate of execution force operations exceeds 90% according to classified Assassinorum records, though this figure excludes missions where entire teams disappeared without trace and their fates remain unknown. The high success rate reflects both the careful target selection that precedes deployment authorization and the overwhelming capabilities that multiple specialized assassins bring to bear against even the most formidable enemies. Failures typically result from intelligence errors that mischaracterize target capabilities or defenses, or from unexpected complications such as demonic intervention or the presence of additional threats not identified during mission planning. The Assassinorum conducts extensive analysis of failed operations, incorporating lessons learned into training programs and operational planning procedures to reduce the likelihood of similar failures in future missions. The War of the Beast erupted in the 32nd millennium as the largest orc invasion the Imperium had faced since the Great Crusade, a catastrophe that exposed fundamental weaknesses in Imperial defenses and nearly brought humanity's interstellar civilization to complete collapse. The orc warlord known only as the Beast commanded forces that dwarfed typical WoW invasions, wielding technology that approached the sophistication of the ancient Krork from whom the orcs descended. His forces deployed weapons and tactics that caught Imperial military commanders completely unprepared, including attack moons, planetoid-sized spacecraft bristling with weapons capable of reducing worlds to rubble. The beast's strategic acumen exceeded anything the Imperium expected from Xenos, his forces executing coordinated multi-sector offensives that suggested intelligence networks and planning capabilities Imperial analysts had never attributed to Orc leadership. The war's initial phases saw catastrophic Imperial defeats across multiple segmentums. Entire Space Marine chapters disappeared fighting the Orc invasion, their fortress monasteries destroyed, and their gene seed lost. Imperial Navy battle groups that had maintained security in their sectors for centuries found themselves overwhelmed by Orc attack craft, whose numbers seemed inexhaustible. Forge worlds fell silent as Orc forces captured or destroyed the manufacturing centers that supplied Imperial military forces. The scale of the disaster forced the High Lords of Terra to acknowledge that conventional military responses proved insufficient against an enemy who matched Imperial strategic capabilities while commanding resources that appeared unlimited. The Officio Assassinorum deployed operatives against Orc leadership targets throughout the conflict, attempting to decapitate the invasion through precision elimination of key warbosses and strategic commanders. Vindicare assassins eliminated dozens of Orc leaders, their Exodus rifles proving effective even against the massive physiology of particularly large warbosses. Eversor operatives deployed into Orc command compounds, their berserker assaults creating chaos that disrupted enemy coordination. Culexus assassins targeted the few Orc weirdboys powerful enough to coordinate forces across planetary distances, their anti-psychic presence disrupting the Gestalt psychic field that gave Orc technology its inexplicable functionality. Yet these successes failed to halt the invasion's momentum, as new Orc leaders emerged to replace those eliminated, and the beast himself remained beyond the Assassinorum's reach. The beast's attack on Terra itself represented the greatest crisis the Imperium had faced since the Horus Heresy. Orc forces penetrated the Sol system's outer defenses, their attack moon approaching the throne world despite desperate resistance from Imperial Navy fleets and defensive installations. The High Lords convened an emergency session within the Imperial Palace, coordinating defensive preparations while simultaneously planning evacuation protocols should Terra's defenses fail completely. The Officio Assassinorum mobilized every available operative, preparing for potential deployment against Orc forces that might penetrate the palace itself. Temple masters abandoned their normal administrative duties to personally lead defensive preparations, understanding that the organization's survival depended on Terra's defense. The Orc assault culminated in a ground invasion that saw greenskin forces fighting through the palace's outer districts. Space Marine chapters responding to Terra's defense engaged in brutal close-quarters combat against Orc warriors, whose size and ferocity matched their own enhanced capabilities. The Adeptus Custodes deployed from their stations, guarding the Sanctum Imperialis, their intervention turning the tide in critical sectors where Imperial defenders faced being overwhelmed. The Assassinorum committed operatives in direct combat roles that violated normal operational doctrine, Temple masters recognizing that conventional assassination methodologies proved irrelevant when the enemy literally besieged their headquarters. Callidus assassins abandoned infiltration tactics to fight alongside Imperial defenders, their phase swords cutting through Orc armor with devastating effectiveness. Eversor operatives deployed without specific target assignments, simply unleashed into Orc formations where their berserker rage and enhanced combat capabilities inflicted catastrophic casualties. The High Lord's Council chamber became a target during the height of the invasion. Orc commandos penetrated the palace's inner districts, their assault aimed at eliminating the Imperium's leadership in a single devastating strike. The attack achieved partial success. Several High Lords died in the initial assault, their bodyguards overwhelmed by the speed and ferocity of the Orc attack. The Grand Master of Assassins, a former Callidus Temple Master named Essed Krieger, fell defending the council chamber alongside his fellow High Lords. Reports from surviving witnesses described Krieger engaging multiple Orc knobs simultaneously, his phase sword technique allowing him to eliminate several attackers before superior numbers overwhelmed him. His death represented not merely the loss of the Assassinorum's highest-ranking officer, but the elimination of institutional knowledge and political connections that had taken decades to develop. The casualties among the High Lords extended beyond the Grand Master. The Master of the Administratum died when the council chamber's ceiling collapsed during the fighting, his death creating immediate administrative chaos as the Imperium's vast bureaucratic apparatus lost its central coordination. The Lord Commander Militant of the Imperial Guard perished leading a counterattack against Orc forces threatening the council's evacuation route. Other High Lords sustained injuries that left them unable to continue their duties, creating vacancies across the Senatorum Imperialis at precisely the moment when coordinated leadership proved most critical. The beheading, as this catastrophe became known in classified imperial records, left the Imperium's highest governing body decimated and struggling to maintain basic functionality. The Assassinorum faced its own institutional crisis as news of the Grand Master's death reached temple facilities across Terra. The organization's command structure, designed around the Grand Master's central authority and coordination between temple masters, suddenly lacked its keystone element. Temple masters who had deferred to Krieger's authority on strategic matters found themselves without clear guidance regarding operational priorities or resource allocation. Individual temples possessed sufficient autonomy to continue routine operations, but coordinating responses to the ongoing crisis required leadership that the temple masters collectively struggled to provide. Debates erupted regarding succession procedures, with different temples advocating for candidates from their own ranks while questioning the qualifications of nominees from rival clades. Draken Vangorich emerged as the leading candidate for Grand Master through a combination of political acumen, operational experience, and timing that bordered on suspicious. Vangorich had served as the master of the Vindicare Temple for nearly 3 decades, his tenure marked by successful operations that enhanced the temple's reputation and expanded its influence within the Assassinorum. His background included decades of field service as an active Vindicare assassin, during which he eliminated targets ranging from heretical planetary governors to Xenos commanders, whose deaths significantly impacted enemy operations. His transition to administrative leadership demonstrated capabilities beyond simple marksmanship. He navigated temple politics effectively, secured resource allocations that improved Vindicare training facilities, and established cooperative relationships with other imperial institutions, including elements of the Inquisition and Adeptus Mechanicus. Vangorich's nomination received support from multiple temple masters who viewed him as a compromise candidate capable of maintaining the organization's cohesion during the crisis. His Vindicare background provided credibility with the largest and most influential temple, while his demonstrated administrative competence appealed to temple masters concerned about the practical challenges of coordinating operations during the ongoing war. The Callidus Temple Master supported Vangorich's candidacy despite traditional rivalry between the temples, recognizing that the organization required stable leadership more urgently than it needed to advance narrow factional interests. The Eversor Temple Master, whose clade typically avoided political maneuvering, endorsed Vangorich after receiving assurances that temple autonomy would remain protected under his leadership. The Culexus Temple Master abstained from the selection process entirely, a decision that reflected both the temple's isolation from broader Assassinorum politics and the practical reality that Culexus operatives' disturbing nature made them unsuitable for positions requiring extensive interaction with other imperial institutions. Vangorich secured unanimous approval from the participating temple masters within weeks of Krieger's death, his confirmation occurring with unusual speed given the typically lengthy deliberations that characterized Grand Master selection. Some observers later questioned whether Vangorich had prepared his candidacy before Krieger's death, though no evidence ever emerged suggesting he possessed foreknowledge of the attack that created the vacancy. Vangorich assumed the Grand Master position during the war's most desperate phase, with Orc forces still threatening multiple Imperial sectors and Terra's defenses still recovering from the attack that had killed his predecessor. His initial actions focused on restoring operational coordination between temples and ensuring that assassination operations continued supporting Imperial military efforts. He instituted daily briefings where temple masters reported on ongoing operations and coordinated responses to emerging threats, creating communication channels that had atrophied under Krieger's more hands-off leadership style. Vangorich personally reviewed target nominations submitted by various Imperial institutions, applying rigorous standards that eliminated requests he judged as politically motivated rather than strategically necessary. The new Grand Master demonstrated particular interest in intelligence gathering and analysis, expanding the Assassinorum's information networks beyond their traditional focus on target identification. He established relationships with inquisitors whose investigative work provided early warning about emerging threats, creating informal cooperation agreements that gave the Assassinorum access to intelligence that might otherwise have remained siloed within the Inquisition's internal networks. Vangorich cultivated contacts within the Adeptus Mechanicus, securing access to technical intelligence about enemy capabilities and defensive systems that improved operational planning for temple operations. His networking extended to Imperial Guard command staff and naval intelligence officers, building a web of information sources that provided the Assassinorum with threat assessments far more comprehensive than the organization had previously maintained. The war eventually concluded through combined military efforts that pushed Orc forces back from Terra and eliminated the Beast himself during a desperate assault on his command center. The victory came at enormous cost. Entire Space Marine chapters had been destroyed, hundreds of worlds lay in ruins, and the Imperium's military forces required decades of rebuilding to recover their pre-war strength. The High Lords of Terra faced the monumental task of coordinating reconstruction efforts while simultaneously filling the vacancies in their own ranks created by the beheading. The selection process for new High Lords became contentious as various Imperial factions maneuvered to secure representation for their interests, each group recognizing that the Senatorum's composition would shape Imperial policy for generations. Vangorich received appointment to the High Lords during this reorganization, filling the Grand Master of Assassins' traditional seat on the council. His appointment occurred without significant opposition, as most factions viewed the Assassinorum as a necessary institution whose representation among the High Lords served legitimate security interests rather than factional advantage. Vangorich's initial participation in High Lords' deliberations followed established patterns. He contributed expertise on security matters, advised on threats requiring precision elimination rather than military campaigns, and generally operated within the role his predecessors had established. His voting patterns aligned with moderate factions seeking to balance reconstruction priorities against the need to maintain military readiness for future threats. The Grand Master's behavior shifted gradually over the following years as reconstruction efforts struggled and political divisions among the High Lords intensified. Vangorich grew increasingly frustrated with what he perceived as incompetence and corruption among his fellow High Lords, many of whom seemed more concerned with advancing factional interests than addressing the Imperium's genuine security needs. He witnessed High Lords blocking military appropriations for political reasons, saw reconstruction resources diverted to politically connected worlds, while more strategically important planets received inadequate support, and observed the Senatorum descending into paralysis as personal rivalries prevented coherent policy formation. His background as an assassin, trained to identify and eliminate threats with surgical precision, left him poorly equipped to navigate the complex political compromises that characterized normal High Lords operations. Vangorich began consolidating power through methods that exploited his unique position and capabilities. He expanded the Assassinorum's intelligence networks under the justification of improving threat assessment, but the information gathered increasingly focused on other High Lords and their political activities rather than external enemies. Temple operatives conducted surveillance on fellow Assassinorum members, documenting their private meetings, financial transactions, and personal indiscretions. Vangorich accumulated files detailing corruption, incompetence, and various transgressions that could be weaponized against political opponents. The information gathering occurred quietly enough that most High Lords remained unaware their colleague was building comprehensive dossiers on their activities. The Grand Master simultaneously strengthened his control over the Assassinorum itself, ensuring that Temple Masters remained loyal to him personally rather than viewing themselves as independent operators who merely coordinated through his office. He rotated Temple Master positions more frequently than his predecessors, replacing long-serving leaders with candidates whose appointments he personally approved. Vangorich involved himself directly in operational planning for major assassination missions, inserting his authority into decisions that previous Grand Masters had delegated to Temple Masters. He controlled resource allocations between temples, rewarding those whose leaders demonstrated loyalty while restricting support to temples whose masters questioned his expanding authority. These actions gradually transformed the Assassinorum from a confederation of semi-autonomous temples into a more centralized organization that reflected Vangorich's personal vision and priorities. The purge began approximately 5 years after Vangorich's appointment to the High Lords, triggered by a political crisis that threatened to paralyze the Assassinorum completely. A coalition of High Lords attempted to block military appropriations that Vangorich considered essential for maintaining imperial defenses, their opposition motivated by factional politics rather than genuine strategic disagreement. The Grand Master concluded that the Imperium's survival required eliminating the political deadlock through direct action, reasoning that removing obstructionist High Lords would allow more competent individuals to assume their positions. His decision to deploy Assassinorum assets against fellow High Lords represented an unprecedented abuse of his office, transforming an organization designed to protect the Imperium into an instrument of internal political violence. The initial eliminations occurred with sufficient subtlety that most observers attributed them to natural causes or accidents. A High Lord known for opposing military spending died in his sleep from apparent heart failure, the death attributed to stress and advanced age. Another High Lord who had blocked reconstruction appropriations perished in a transport accident when his shuttle suffered catastrophic systems failure during atmospheric flight. A third High Lord, particularly vocal in criticizing Vangorich's expansion of Assassinorum intelligence activities, succumbed to a sudden illness that medical personnel struggled to diagnose before his death. These deaths occurred over several months, their spacing and apparent natural causes preventing immediate recognition of the pattern. Vangorich's purge expanded as political opposition to his actions coalesced among surviving High Lords who belatedly recognized the threat he represented. The Grand Master abandoned subtlety, deploying temple operatives in direct assassination operations that made no attempt to disguise their nature. High Lords died in their fortified residences despite extensive security measures, their bodyguards slaughtered by Eversor operatives or bypassed entirely by Callidus assassins who assumed trusted identities. Vindicare snipers eliminated targets during public appearances, their extreme-range shots preventing identification of firing positions before the assassins withdrew. The Assassinorum Imperialis found itself under siege from within, its members unable to trust their own security forces or identify which of their colleagues might secretly support Vangorich's actions. The purge extended beyond the High Lords themselves to include lower-ranking officials, military commanders, and administratum personnel whom Vangorich identified as threats or obstacles to his vision of imperial governance. Planetary governors who had cultivated relationships with purged High Lords received visits from temple operatives, their deaths sending messages to other regional leaders about the consequences of political opposition. Imperial Guard generals whose loyalty Vangorich questioned disappeared or died in circumstances that prevented investigation. Administratum officials who might have exposed evidence of the Grand Master's activities suffered fatal accidents or sudden illnesses that removed them before they could act on their knowledge. The scale of Vangorich's purge eventually provoked responses from imperial institutions powerful enough to resist Assassinorum operations. The Adeptus Astartes, whose chapters had suffered devastating casualties during the War of the Beast, viewed the Grand Master's actions as betrayal of the Imperium they had bled to defend. Chapter Masters meeting in emergency conclave concluded that Vangorich represented a threat comparable to the Xeno's enemies they routinely fought. His transformation of the Assassinorum into a tool of tyranny, undermining the imperial system the Space Marines existed to protect. The chapters prepared for direct military action against the Grand Master, recognizing that conventional political processes could not remove someone who controlled the Imperium's assassination apparatus. The assault on the Imperial Palace involved Space Marines from multiple chapters, their combined forces representing the largest Astartes deployment to Terra since the Horus Heresy. The Imperial Fists, whose Primarch Rogel Dorn had designed the palace's defenses, led the operation with intimate knowledge of the fortress's layout and defensive systems. The Halo Brethren, survivors of the Beast's attack who had witnessed the original beheading, participated to avenge the High Lords who had died during that crisis. Other chapters contributed forces in a show of unity that demonstrated the Adeptus Astartes' collective determination to end Vangorich's reign. The Space Marines approached their mission with grim determination, understanding they might face Assassinorum operatives whose capabilities rivaled their own enhanced abilities. Vangorich deployed temple assets in defense of his position, ordering operatives to eliminate the Space Marine assault force before it could reach the Senatorum chambers. Vindicare assassins established firing positions throughout the palace, their Exodus rifles targeting Space Marine commanders and attempting to disrupt the assault's coordination. Eversor operatives deployed directly against advancing Astartes units, their berserker fury and enhanced combat capabilities allowing them to engage Space Marines in close combat despite the enormous disparity in size and strength. Callidus assassins attempted infiltration operations, using polymorphine to assume the identities of palace defenders and create confusion about which forces remained loyal to the Grand Master. The palace became a battlefield where the Imperium's most elite warriors fought against assassins whose training focused specifically on eliminating targets that conventional forces could not touch. The Space Marines' superiority in direct combat eventually overwhelmed the Assassinorum's defensive efforts. Power-armored Astartes advanced through temple ambushes that would have destroyed normal military units, their enhanced physiology allowing them to survive wounds that killed unaugmented humans instantly. Vindicare snipers discovered that Space Marine armor and enhanced bone structure made headshots unreliable, forcing them to attempt multiple hits against targets who closed distance rapidly between shots. Eversor operatives found themselves outmatched despite their chemical enhancement and surgical modification, as Space Marines combined comparable physical capabilities with superior tactical coordination and centuries of combat experience. The assault reached the Senatorum chambers within hours of its commencement, the Space Marines' determination and combat prowess proving unstoppable despite the Assassinorum's desperate resistance. Vangorich died in the Senatorum chambers, cornered by Space Marines who had fought through every defensive measure he deployed against them. The specific circumstances of his death remain classified, though surviving accounts indicate he attempted to negotiate surrender before the Space Marines executed him for his crimes against the Imperium. His death ended the purge immediately, as temple masters who had followed his orders recognized that continued resistance would result in the Assassinorum's complete destruction. The organization stood down, its operatives withdrawing from defensive positions and surrendering to Space Marine custody pending investigation of their actions during Vangorich's reign. The reforms imposed following Vangorich's death fundamentally altered the Assassinorum's relationship with other imperial institutions. The Grand Master's permanent seat among the High Lords was revoked, with future representation dependent on specific appointment during periods when the Senatorum judged Assassinorum participation necessary. This change eliminated the automatic political power that had enabled Vangorich's abuses, ensuring that future Grand Masters could not leverage High Lord status to pursue personal agendas. New oversight mechanisms required that all assassination operations receive approval from multiple High Lords rather than proceeding on the Grand Master's sole authority, creating checks against the organization becoming an instrument of political violence. Temple autonomy increased as reforms deliberately fragmented the centralized authority that Vangorich had constructed, returning the organization toward its original structure as a confederation of specialized clades coordinated through the Grand Master's office rather than controlled by it. The beheading and its aftermath marked the Assassinorum's greatest institutional crisis, a period when the organization nearly destroyed itself through internal corruption and abuse of power. The reforms that followed shaped the organization's operations for the following millennia, establishing limitations and oversight that prevented future Grand Masters from wielding the unchecked authority that Vangorich had accumulated. The temple system survived, its specialized capabilities too valuable for the Imperium to abandon, despite the catastrophic failures of leadership that had temporarily transformed assassins into tyrants. The Officio Assassinorum's operational history spans 10 millennia of warfare against enemies, whose elimination served Imperial strategic interests more effectively than conventional military campaigns. These operations demonstrate the versatility of assassination as a tool of statecraft, revealing how single deaths can reshape conflicts that might otherwise consume entire sectors in protracted warfare. The targets range from chaos cultists, whose corruption threatens planetary populations, to Xenos commanders, whose tactical brilliance makes them disproportionately dangerous to Imperial forces. Each successful operation validates the Emperor's original vision for the organization, that precision elimination of key individuals prevents larger catastrophes and conserves resources that mass warfare would expend wastefully. The execution of the Apostles of the Blind King represents one of the Assassinorum's most significant anti-chaos operations, targeting word-bearers' dark apostles, whose preaching threatened to corrupt entire subsectors of the segmentum obscurus. The Blind King himself, a demon prince whose true name remains sealed in inquisitorial vaults, commanded a warband that combined military conquest with religious conversion, establishing chaos cults on conquered worlds that persisted long after his forces withdrew. His dark apostles functioned as the primary vectors for this corruption, each commanding sufficient theological knowledge and warp-granted powers to convert planetary populations through a combination of preaching and psychic manipulation. Imperial military forces struggled to counter this threat effectively. Killing the apostles in conventional combat proved difficult given their demonic protection, while their dispersed deployment across multiple worlds prevented concentrated military responses. The Officio Assassinorum deployed a coordinated operation involving operatives from multiple temples, recognizing that the apostles' varied capabilities required different assassination approaches. Vindicare assassins eliminated 3 apostles who maintained relatively exposed command positions, their Exodus rifles firing shield-breaker rounds that penetrated the warp-based defenses surrounding the Chaos Priests. The shots occurred across distances exceeding 3 kilometers in each case, the extreme range preventing the apostles' bodyguards from identifying firing positions before the Vindicare operatives withdrew. One particularly notable elimination involved an apostle conducting a mass ritual on the world of Gospora, his psychic presence so powerful that it created visible distortions in the air around him. The Vindicare operative compensated for these distortions through calculations that accounted for the warp energy's refractive effects, placing a turbo-penetrator round through the apostle's primary heart despite the challenging shot geometry. Callidus operatives eliminated 2 apostles through extended infiltration operations that required months of preparation. The assassins used polymorphine to assume the identities of cultists who had gained the apostles' trust through years of service to the Chaos Warband. One operative spent 8 months embedded within a cult hierarchy before achieving sufficient proximity to her target to strike with a phase sword during a ritual ceremony. The apostle died instantly, his death causing the ritual to collapse and trigger a psychic backlash that killed dozens of cultists in the immediate vicinity. The Callidus operative escaped amid the chaos, her assumed identity providing cover as she withdrew from the cult compound before survivors could organize pursuit. The second Callidus operation involved replacing a dark apostle's personal bodyguard, the operative maintaining her false identity for 6 months while waiting for an opportunity when the target's demonic protections would be temporarily weakened. The assassination occurred during a ritual that required the apostle to dismiss his warp-based defenses, the brief vulnerability window allowing the phase sword to strike before the protective wards could reconstitute. The remaining apostles required Culexus intervention due to their extensive psychic abilities and demonic patronage. These chaos priests maintained such powerful connections to the warp that conventional assassination approaches proved ineffective. Their precognitive abilities warned them of approaching dangers, while bound demons provided protection that defeated physical attacks. Culexus operatives approached these targets with their anti-psychic presence, disrupting the apostles' powers and forcing their demonic protectors to dissipate or retreat. The apostles found themselves suddenly vulnerable, their centuries of warp granted power useless against enemies whose very existence negated psychic phenomena. Animus speculum fire reduced the chaos priests to withered corpses, their souls torn from their bodies despite the dark gods' attempts to preserve their favored servants. The coordinated elimination of the Blind King's apostles within a 2-month period crippled his warband's expansion, forcing the Demon Prince to withdraw from the subsector as his cult networks collapsed without their spiritual leadership. Word-bearers' operations continue to represent a significant portion of Assassinorum anti-chaos deployments, as the traitor legions' focus on religious corruption makes their leaders priority targets. Dark Apostles function as force multipliers, whose elimination disrupts enemy operations far beyond their immediate military value. A single Dark Apostle might coordinate cult activities across multiple worlds, their removal causing entire networks to fragment as subordinate cultists fight among themselves or abandon their heretical activities without central direction. The Assassinorum maintains dedicated intelligence networks focused on tracking word-bearers' activities, identifying Dark Apostles through their psychic signatures and the patterns of corruption that follow their movements. Temple operatives deploy against these targets with authorization procedures streamlined compared to standard operations, reflecting the Imperium's recognition that word-bearers' spiritual leaders represent existential threats requiring immediate elimination. Xeno's elimination campaigns demonstrate the Assassinorum's versatility against non-human threats whose biology and psychology differ radically from human targets. Orc warbosses present unique challenges due to their massive physiology and the Gestalt psychic field that orc populations generate. A warboss functions as more than a military commander. His presence focuses the orc Gestalt field, creating a psychic effect that makes nearby orcs more dangerous and their ramshackle technology more reliable. Eliminating a warboss disrupts this field, causing the Wa to fragment as rival orcs fight for dominance rather than maintaining unified assault against Imperial forces. Vindicare operatives typically handle warboss eliminations, their Exodus rifles firing turbo-penetrator rounds capable of piercing the thick skull bones and dense muscle tissue that protect orc leaders. The shots require precise placement. Orc physiology includes redundant organs and distributed nervous systems that allow them to survive wounds that would kill humans instantly, making headshots the only reliably lethal targeting option. The elimination of Warboss Grimtooth during the Callidus campaign exemplifies successful anti-orc operations. Grimtooth commanded a Wa that threatened 3 Imperial sectors, his forces demonstrating unusual tactical coordination that suggested the warboss possessed intelligence exceeding normal orc standards. Imperial Guard forces engaged Grimtooth's armies for 2 years without achieving decisive victories, the Orc leader adapting his tactics to counter Imperial strategies with disturbing effectiveness. A Vindicare operative deployed to the war zone spent 4 months studying Grimtooth's movements and security arrangements, identifying patterns in the warboss's behavior that created brief vulnerability windows. The operative established a firing position in the ruins of a destroyed Imperial facility, concealing himself among rubble approximately 2 kilometers from Grimtooth's primary command location. The shot occurred during a gathering, where Grimtooth emerged to settle a dispute between rival Orc leaders, the brief exposure providing the only clear firing line the operative had observed during months of surveillance. The turbo-penetrator round struck Grimtooth between the eyes, the penetrator stage punching through his reinforced skull before the plasma charge detonated inside his brain cavity. The warboss died instantly, his body collapsing before his bodyguards registered the distant crack of the rifle shot. The WA fragmented within days as rival Orcs fought for leadership, allowing Imperial forces to defeat the Greenskins in detail rather than facing them as a unified threat. Tau ethereal eliminations represent some of the Assassinorum's most politically sensitive Xenos operations, as these targets function as the spiritual and political leadership of the Tau Empire. Ethereals possess some form of influence over other Tau castes that Imperial xenobiologists struggle to explain. Their presence inspires absolute loyalty, and their commands receive unquestioning obedience even when they contradict tactical sense or self-preservation instincts. Some Imperial researchers theorize that ethereals emit pheromones or low-level psychic effects that override normal Tau decision-making processes, though the mechanism remains poorly understood. Regardless of the explanation, eliminating ethereals creates immediate chaos in Tau forces as the affected castes suddenly find themselves without the compulsion that previously directed their actions. Tau warriors exposed to ethereal death sometimes flee combat or surrender to Imperial forces, their previous fanatical determination evaporating without the ethereal's presence to sustain it. Callidus operatives handle most ethereal eliminations due to the extreme difficulty of approaching these targets through conventional means. Tau security protocols surrounding ethereals include multiple layers of fire-cast warriors, drone surveillance systems, and sophisticated detection equipment that makes long-range sniping impractical. Callidus assassins use polymorphine to assume Tau forms, a transformation that pushes the drug's capabilities to their limits given the significant physiological differences between human and Tau biology. The operative must modify bone structure to accommodate Tau skeletal geometry, adjust muscle distribution to match Tau movement patterns, and alter facial features to replicate Tau physiognomy. The transformation requires days to complete and causes even more severe pain than standard polymorphine shifts due to the extreme nature of the changes involved. Once transformed, the operative infiltrates Tau facilities using forged identification and carefully constructed cover identities that explain their presence. The assassination occurs when the operative achieves proximity to the target ethereal, typically during conferences or ceremonies where multiple Tau castes gather. Phase swords prove devastatingly effective against ethereals, whose relatively fragile physiology compared to human combat specialists makes them vulnerable to weapons that bypass their technological defenses. Tyrannid synapse creature elimination represents perhaps the Assassinorum's most challenging Xenos operations, as these targets exist within hive fleet environments that present extreme dangers to human operatives. Synapse creatures function as nodes in the hive mind's control network, their psychic presence coordinating lesser tyrannid organisms and maintaining the swarm's tactical cohesion. Eliminating synapse creatures causes nearby tyrannid organisms to revert to instinctive behavior, breaking the coordinated assault patterns that make hive fleets so lethal. However, reaching these targets requires operatives to penetrate tyrannid-controlled territory where every organism functions as a potential threat, and where the environment itself often becomes hostile due to tyrannid biological modifications. Vindicare assassins engage synapse creatures from extreme range when battlefield conditions permit, their Exodus rifles targeting the distinctive psychic signatures that synapse creatures emit. The shots must account for the chaotic nature of tyrannid battlefields, where swarms of lesser organisms create visual obstructions, and where the targets themselves move erratically through terrain that conventional forces find impassable. Hellfire rounds prove particularly effective against synapse creatures, the Xenos' derived toxins overcoming even the Tyrannid's remarkable biological resilience. One documented operation during the defense of Forge World Metallica involved a Vindicare operative who eliminated 3 Tyrannid warriors functioning as synapse nodes during a single engagement, each shot fired from a position more than 4 kilometers from the targets. The eliminations occurred during a critical phase of the battle, when Imperial forces faced being overwhelmed by coordinated Tyrannid assault, the synapse creatures' deaths causing the swarm to fragment long enough for Imperial defenders to re-establish defensive positions. Operations supporting Imperial military campaigns represent routine Assassinorum deployments that occur constantly across the galaxy, though individual missions rarely receive the attention devoted to operations against major threats. Planetary governors who refuse Imperial tithes or who demonstrate incompetence that threatens sector stability find themselves targeted for elimination, their deaths allowing more compliant or capable individuals to assume leadership. Heretical cult leaders operating in Imperial territory receive visits from temple operatives before their movements grow large enough to require military intervention. Rogue Imperial commanders whose actions threaten broader strategic objectives disappear under circumstances that prevent their followers from organizing resistance or seeking vengeance. These operations maintain the Imperium's internal stability, eliminating problems before they metastasize into crises requiring significant military resources to resolve. Cooperation with Space Marine chapters occurs when Assassinorum objectives align with Astartes operations, though these joint efforts remain relatively rare due to philosophical differences between the organizations. Space Marines emphasize direct confrontation and overwhelming force, their combat doctrine viewing assassination as dishonorable compared to open warfare. The Assassinorum's methods, infiltration, deception, and elimination of targets who never realize danger approaches, conflict with Space Marine preferences for announcing their presence and allowing enemies to face them in battle. However, pragmatic chapter masters recognize that certain targets require elimination through precision rather than assault, particularly when conventional military approaches would result in excessive casualties, or when the target possesses capabilities that make direct confrontation impractical. The months of shame following the First War for Armageddon demonstrated both the potential and the limitations of Space Marine Assassinorum cooperation. Space Wolves forces defending Armageddon against the demonic incursion, led by the demon Primarch Angron, fought alongside Assassinorum operatives deployed to eliminate key Chaos commanders, coordinating the invasion. Vindicare assassins provided long-range fire support during Space Wolves' assaults on Chaos positions, their Exodus rifles eliminating Bloodthirster heralds and Chaos sorcerers, whose powers threatened to overwhelm Astartes' battle lines. The cooperation proved effective during the actual combat operations, with Space Wolves appreciating the tactical advantage that precision elimination provided. However, the relationship deteriorated following the conflict when Inquisitor Cisneros demanded that Space Wolves, who had fought against the demons, submit to mind wiping or execution to preserve secrecy about the demonic incursion. The Assassinorum's refusal to deploy operatives against the Space Wolves created lasting tensions with elements of the Inquisition, while simultaneously earning grudging respect from the Space Wolves themselves. Failed missions occur with sufficient regularity that the Assassinorum maintains extensive procedures for analyzing unsuccessful operations and recovering compromised operatives when possible. The organization accepts that not every target can be eliminated regardless of operative skill or preparation quality, Some individuals possess capabilities or protections that defeat even the most carefully planned assassination attempts. Chaos champions protected by demonic pacts sometimes receive warning of approaching assassins through their warp patrons, allowing them to prepare defenses or evacuate before operatives reach strike positions. Eldar farseers whose precognitive abilities let them glimpse potential futures sometimes perceive assassination attempts before they occur, taking actions that prevent the foreseen outcomes from manifesting. Targets with extensive cybernetic augmentation occasionally survive wounds that should prove lethal, their artificial organs maintaining life support long enough for medical intervention to save them. The loss of operatives during failed missions represents significant setbacks beyond the immediate failure to eliminate targets. Each temple operative embodies decades of training investment and represents irreplaceable institutional knowledge about specialized techniques. Temple masters conduct detailed investigations of failed operations, analyzing every decision point and environmental factor that contributed to mission failure. The investigations serve multiple purposes. They identify weaknesses in operational planning or training that require correction. They determine whether failures resulted from operator error or from factors beyond operative control, and they assess whether mission parameters should be revised for future attempts against similar targets. Some investigations reveal that targets were mischaracterized during initial intelligence gathering, their actual capabilities exceeding the threat assessments that justified specific temple selections or tactical approaches. Compromised operations create security risks that extend beyond individual mission failures. Enemies who capture or kill temple operatives gain opportunities to study Assassinorum equipment and techniques, potentially developing countermeasures that reduce future operational effectiveness. The molecular disassembly systems built into Eversor operatives prevent detailed study of their augmentations and equipment, but other temple operatives lack similar fail-safes. Captured Callidus operatives provide enemies with polymorphine samples that xenobiologists or chaos sorcerers might analyze to understand the substance's properties. Dead Vindicare assassins yield Exodus rifles, whose construction techniques reveal Imperial weapons technology that enemies can attempt to replicate or counter. The Assassinorum accepts these risks as inevitable costs of operations, reasoning that the strategic value of successful eliminations justifies occasional losses even when those losses compromise operational security. The Ecclesiad War during the 41st millennium demonstrated how failed Assassinorum operations can create cascading strategic consequences. The conflict began when the Ecclesiarch Bucharest declared 5 entire sectors independent from the Imperium, his forces including corrupted Imperial Guard regiments and Space Marine chapters that had fallen under his influence through a combination of religious rhetoric and chaos corruption. The Officio Assassinorum deployed multiple operatives against Bucharest himself, recognizing that eliminating the heretical ecclesiarch would likely cause his rebellion to collapse. 3 separate assassination attempts failed. A Vindicare operative's shot missed when Bucharest moved unexpectedly at the moment of firing. A Callidus assassin was exposed when her polymorphine transformation began reverting prematurely due to contaminated drug supplies, and a Culexus operative found that Bucharest possessed protection from blanks through a demonic pact that specifically countered anti-psychic effects. The failed attempts forced the Imperium to prosecute a conventional military campaign that consumed years and cost millions of lives, the war finally ending only when Sebastian Thor led a massive crusade that defeated Bucharest's forces through overwhelming military superiority rather than surgical elimination of their leadership. Lost operatives whose fates remain unknown represent ongoing concerns for temple masters who must balance operational security against the faint possibility that missing assassins might eventually return from deep cover missions or escape from enemy captivity. Some operatives disappear during insertion phases, their transport craft lost to warp storms or enemy action before reaching target zones. Others vanish during extended operations in hostile territory, their last communications indicating they remained mission-capable before all contact ceased. The Assassinorum maintains records of missing operatives extending back millennia, each file documenting the circumstances of disappearance and any subsequent intelligence suggesting the operative's fate. Temple doctrine presumes that operatives missing for more than one standard year have died or suffered capture that compromised their knowledge, triggering security reviews that assess whether ongoing operations require modification based on potentially compromised information. The Great Rift's emergence in the closing years of the 41st millennium fundamentally altered the operational environment for the Officio Assassinorum, creating challenges that no amount of training or preparation could have anticipated. The massive warp storm that split the galaxy from the galactic north to the south severed conventional communication and travel between the two halves of the Imperium, transforming what had been a unified, if sprawling domain into two distinct regions operating with minimal coordination. The Imperium Sanctus, encompassing Terra and the regions that retained relatively stable warp routes, maintained contact with the Assassinorum's central command structure and temple facilities. The Imperium Nihilus, trapped on the dark side of the rift where the Astronomican's light could not reach, found itself isolated from the organization's traditional support networks and coordination mechanisms. Temple facilities in Nihilus sectors faced immediate operational crises as their connection to Terra-based command structures disappeared behind the rift's impassable barrier. Operatives deployed on long-term missions discovered themselves unable to receive updated orders or request extraction when circumstances changed. Temple outposts that had relied on regular supply shipments from Forge Worlds in Segmentum Solar found themselves without access to specialized equipment, ammunition, or the exotic materials necessary for maintaining their capabilities. Polymorphine stocks dwindled as Callidus facilities exhausted their reserves without possibility of resupply from the synthesis laboratories on Terra. Vindicare operatives faced similar shortages of specialized Exodus rounds, forcing them to ration ammunition that previous doctrine had treated as effectively unlimited given the Assassinorum's extensive manufacturing capacity. The communication breakdown created coordination failures that cascaded across multiple operational theaters. Temple masters commanding facilities in Nihilus sectors could not coordinate their activities with counterparts in other regions, leading to situations where multiple operatives deployed against the same targets without knowledge of each other's missions. Intelligence networks that had provided early warning about emerging threats collapsed as information could no longer flow across the rift, leaving Temple commanders dependent on local sources that lacked the comprehensive perspective that Terra-based analysis had previously provided. Authorization protocols that required approval from the Grand Master's office or the High Lords became impossible to follow, forcing Temple masters to make operational decisions that exceeded their traditional authority simply to maintain basic functionality. Individual operatives adapted to these circumstances with varying degrees of success depending on their temple training and the specific situations they encountered. Vindicare assassins operating in Nihilus regions continued their missions with minimal disruption initially, as their self-sufficient operational methodology and relatively simple equipment requirements allowed them to function independently for extended periods. The primary challenge they faced involved ammunition shortages. Exodus rounds required manufacturing capabilities that few facilities in Nihilus possessed, and attempts to substitute standard ammunition proved inadequate for targets whose defenses demanded specialized projectiles. Some Vindicare operatives established relationships with local Forge Worlds, trading intelligence or services in exchange for custom ammunition production, though the quality of these improvised rounds rarely matched the precision of Terra-manufactured Exodus ammunition. Callidus operatives faced more severe difficulties as their polymorphine supplies depleted without possibility of replacement. The transformation drug's complex synthesis requirements meant that no facilities in Nihilus possessed the capability to manufacture it, and the existing stocks that Callidus outposts maintained proved insufficient for sustained operations. Operatives found themselves forced to ration polymorphine usage, limiting transformations to only the most critical mission phases and accepting increased risk during infiltration operations. Some Callidus assassins adapted by relying more heavily on conventional disguise techniques and social engineering rather than physical transformation, their training in infiltration methodologies allowing them to maintain effectiveness even without their signature capability. Others abandoned deep cover operations entirely, shifting to shorter duration missions that required fewer polymorphine transformations and accepting that their reduced capabilities meant targeting less heavily defended enemies. Eversor deployments in Nihilus became increasingly problematic as cryo-suspension facilities lost access to the specialized maintenance that Terra-based tech priests had previously provided. The suspension chambers required regular calibration and component replacement to maintain the precise temperature control necessary for preserving operatives without causing cellular damage. Without access to replacement parts and expert technical support, suspension systems began failing with increasing frequency. Some facilities resorted to keeping Eversor operatives in permanent sedation rather than cryosuspension. Accepting the reduced lifespan, this approach caused in exchange for maintaining operational capability. Other outposts simply awakened their Eversor assets and deployed them immediately, reasoning that using the operatives, while they remained viable, served Imperial interests better than watching them deteriorate in failing suspension systems. Culexus operations continued with minimal disruption compared to other temples, as the operatives' capabilities derived from their inherent nature rather than complex equipment or consumable resources. The Animus Speculum helmets required maintenance, but the relatively simple mechanical components proved easier to service using local resources than the sophisticated systems other temples depended upon. Culexus temple masters in Nihilus actually expanded their operations during the early years following the Rift's emergence, recognizing that the proliferation of warp phenomena and demonic incursions created target-rich environments where anti-psychic capabilities proved especially valuable. The operatives deployed against chaos sorcerers coordinating incursions from the Rift, against rogue psychers whose powers had grown unstable due to the increased warp turbulence, and against demonic entities that manifested with disturbing frequency in regions where reality's barriers had weakened. The Indomitus Crusade's launch provided the first opportunity for re-establishing coordination between Nihilus-based temple facilities and the broader Assassinorum command structure. Primarch Robute Guilliman's return and his subsequent organization of the largest Imperial military expedition since the Great Crusade created supply lines and communication channels that penetrated deep into Nihilus territories. The Primarch's forces included Assassinorum operatives assigned to support the Crusade's operations, these assassins serving as couriers who carried updated orders and intelligence to isolated temple facilities encountered during the expedition's advance. The contact allowed temple masters in Nihilus to receive strategic direction from the Grand Master's office for the first time since the Rift's emergence, though the communication remained sporadic and dependent on the Crusade fleet's movements through the region. Guilliman demonstrated sophisticated understanding of the Assassinorum's capabilities during the Crusade's planning and execution phases. His strategic acumen, recognizing situations where precision elimination served Imperial objectives better than conventional military assault. The Primarch authorized execution force deployments against priority targets whose elimination would significantly impact broader campaign objectives, coordinating these operations with fleet movements and ground force deployments to maximize their strategic effect. One notable operation occurred during the liberation of the Ultramar system from Mortarian's forces, where an execution force eliminated several Death Guard plague surgeons, whose biological warfare expertise had created plague vectors that threatened to render entire worlds uninhabitable. The coordinated elimination of these targets disrupted the Death Guard's campaign timeline, forcing Mortarion to commit additional resources to reconstituting his biological warfare capabilities, rather than pressing his offensive against remaining Imperial strongholds. The Primarch's utilization of Assassinorum assets reflected his pragmatic approach to warfare, viewing assassination as a legitimate tactical tool rather than dishonorable subterfuge. This attitude contrasted sharply with perspectives held by many Space Marine commanders, whose cultural preferences for direct confrontation often made them reluctant to coordinate operations with Temple operatives. Guilliman's willingness to integrate Assassinorum capabilities into broader campaign planning created precedents that other Imperial commanders began following, gradually normalizing cooperation between conventional military forces and Temple operatives. The Primarch personally authorized multiple high-priority elimination operations during the Crusade's advance, his strategic assessments identifying targets whose deaths would create disproportionate advantages for Imperial forces. Genestealer cult uprisings proliferated across both Nihilus and Sanctus regions during the era Indomitus, the cults exploiting the chaos created by the Great Rift's emergence to expand their influence and prepare for Tyrannid Hive fleet arrivals. The Assassinorum responded with intensified operations against cult leadership, recognizing that patriarch elimination remained the most effective method for disrupting these Xenos infiltrations before they could summon their Tyrannid overlords. Callidus operatives proved especially effective in these operations, their ability to assume cult member identities allowing them to penetrate the psychic networks that connected cultists to their patriarchs. The operations required careful timing, striking too early risked missing cult members who had not yet revealed themselves, while waiting too long allowed cults to grow beyond the point where leadership elimination alone could prevent their planned uprisings. Temple intelligence networks identified disturbing patterns in cult activities that suggested coordination beyond what individual patriarchs should possess. Multiple cults across different sectors demonstrated synchronized timing in their operations, their uprisings occurring in sequences that seemed designed to draw Imperial military forces away from strategically important locations. Some Inquisitors theorized that the hive mind itself had evolved more sophisticated strategic planning capabilities, using genestealer cults as coordinated assets rather than independent infiltration vectors. The Assassinorum adapted its anti-cult operations to account for this possibility, prioritizing patriarch eliminations in ways that disrupted apparent coordination patterns, rather than simply targeting the largest or most immediate threats. The Death Guard's expansion from their demon world of Plague Planet created new categories of targets that tested the Assassinorum's capabilities against enemies whose chaos corruption made them difficult to eliminate through conventional assassination methods. Plague surgeons who developed new disease vectors proved particularly challenging targets, as their bodies hosted dozens of different plagues that made physical contact lethal even to operatives wearing protective equipment. Vindicare assassins engaged these targets from extreme range when possible, their Hellfire rounds delivering toxins that proved effective even against Nurgle-blessed physiology. The operations required careful intelligence gathering to identify moments when plague surgeons remained sufficiently stationary to permit accurate long-range shots, as the Death Guard's ponderous movement patterns and preference for defensive warfare created fewer targeting opportunities than operations against more mobile enemies. Chaos incursions emerging directly from the Cicatrix Maledictum presented operational environments that pushed Temple capabilities to their limits. Warp rifts opening across Imperial space disgorged demon armies and chaos warbands that materialized without warning in locations where conventional defenses proved inadequate. The Assassinorum deployed operatives against chaos commanders, coordinating these incursions, targeting the mortal leaders whose strategic direction gave coherence to what would otherwise be chaotic demonic rampages. Culexus assassins proved invaluable in these operations, their anti-psychic nature allowing them to approach targets surrounded by warp phenomena that would kill normal humans through simple proximity. The operatives advanced through environments where reality itself had become unstable, their soulless nature providing protection against the mutagenic effects and psychic corruption that transformed unprotected individuals into chaos spawn or worse. The philosophical debates within the Assassinorum regarding the organization's purpose intensified during the era Indomitus, as the scale of threats facing the Imperium exceeded anything the organization had confronted since the Horus Heresy. Some temple masters argued that the Assassinorum should focus exclusively on targets whose elimination served clear strategic purposes, maintaining traditional operational discipline and refusing to deploy operatives in situations where success probability fell below acceptable thresholds. This conservative faction emphasized preservation of temple capabilities for truly critical operations, reasoning that wasting operatives on marginal targets during the current crisis would leave the organization unable to respond when even more dangerous threats emerged. They pointed to historical examples where overextension had compromised temple effectiveness, arguing that maintaining operational standards mattered more than maximizing short-term deployment frequency. Other voices within the organization advocated for more aggressive deployment patterns that accepted higher risks in exchange for eliminating larger numbers of threats. This faction argued that the Imperium's survival depended on utilizing every available asset to maximum effect, that preserving temple capabilities served no purpose if the Imperium collapsed while assassins waited for ideal operational conditions. They emphasized that the Emperor's original vision for the Assassinorum centered on eliminating threats that conventional forces could not address, and that the current crisis created unprecedented numbers of such targets. The debate extended beyond simple operational tempo to encompass fundamental questions about the organization's role, whether it existed primarily to serve as a precision instrument deployed sparingly against carefully selected targets, or whether circumstances demanded transformation into a more broadly applied tool that accepted reduced effectiveness per operation in exchange for greater overall impact. The Grand Master during the early Indomitus period attempted to balance these competing perspectives, authorizing increased deployment rates while maintaining quality standards that prevented the organization from degrading into a conventional special operations force. The compromise satisfied neither faction completely, but prevented the internal divisions from paralyzing operational decision-making. Authorization protocols evolved to account for the changed strategic environment, with temple masters in isolated regions receiving expanded authority to approve operations that would previously have required Grand Master approval. This decentralization reflected pragmatic acceptance that the communication difficulties created by the Great Rift made centralized control impractical, though it created concerns about maintaining consistency in operational standards across facilities that now functioned with significant autonomy. The question of the emperor's will versus pragmatic necessity emerged as a central tension in these debates, reflecting deeper uncertainties about how to interpret the organization's mission during unprecedented circumstances. Traditional Assassinorum doctrine held that the organization served the Emperor's vision for protecting humanity through surgical elimination of specific threats, that each operation should advance clearly defined strategic objectives rather than simply killing enemies because they existed. This interpretation emphasized selectivity and precision, viewing the Assassinorum as fundamentally different from conventional military forces precisely because it refused to deploy its capabilities indiscriminately. However, some within the organization questioned whether this traditional interpretation remained valid when the Imperium faced existential threats on scales that made selective targeting seem inadequate. They argued that the Emperor, were he able to provide direct guidance, would demand maximum utilization of all available resources rather than adherence to doctrinal purity that might prove suicidal during the current crisis. The emergence of Primaris Space Marines and other innovations resulting from Archmago's Belisarius calls work raised additional questions about the Assassinorum's role in an Imperium that had access to new military capabilities. Some temple masters wondered whether the organization's specialized assassination methodologies remained as valuable when the Imperium could field enhanced space marines, whose combat capabilities exceeded those of their predecessors. These concerns proved largely unfounded in practice. The new military assets, while powerful, still faced the same fundamental limitations that had always made assassination a valuable complement to conventional warfare. Primaris Marines could conquer fortresses and destroy armies, but they remained poorly suited for eliminating individual targets, whose deaths required stealth and precision rather than overwhelming force. The Assassinorum's capabilities remained relevant precisely because they addressed operational requirements that even enhanced military forces could not fulfill effectively. Operations supporting the Indomitus Crusade demonstrated the continuing validity of traditional assassination methodologies, even in the context of the largest military mobilization in Imperial history. Guilliman's forces achieved numerous victories through conventional military superiority, their Primaris Marines and modernized equipment providing advantages that allowed them to defeat enemies that had previously seemed invincible. Yet even these enhanced forces benefited from Assassinorum support in situations where precision elimination created opportunities that direct assault could not achieve. A Vindicare operative who killed an Orc warboss coordinating resistance against Crusade forces might enable Imperial victory in a campaign that would otherwise have required months of grinding warfare. A Callidus assassin who eliminated a Chaos cult leader prevented an uprising that would have diverted Crusade resources from primary objectives. These operations validated the Assassinorum's fundamental purpose, not replacing conventional military forces, but complementing them by addressing threats that required capabilities beyond what mass warfare provided. The Assassinorum's adaptation to the era Indomitus reflected the organization's resilience and the enduring validity of its core mission, despite the unprecedented challenges it faced. Temple facilities isolated in Nihilist developed autonomous operational capabilities that allowed them to continue functioning without central coordination. Operatives deployed across both halves of the divided Imperium maintained their effectiveness despite equipment shortages and communication difficulties. The organization preserved its institutional knowledge and training methodologies even as individual facilities struggled with resource constraints. Temple masters made difficult decisions about operational priorities, balancing immediate threats against longer-term strategic considerations, while operating with incomplete information about the broader strategic situation. The eternal mission to eliminate threats that conventional forces cannot address remained as relevant in the era Indomitus as it had been during the Great Crusade 10 millennia earlier. The specific threats evolved. Genestealer cult patriarchs replaced some categories of targets that had been common in earlier eras, while chaos incursions from the Great Rift created new operational environments that previous generations of assassins had never confronted. Yet the fundamental principle endured. Certain enemies required elimination through precision and stealth rather than conventional military assault, and the Imperium required an organization capable of executing these operations with the skill and dedication that defined the Officio Assassinorum. The organization's survival through the catastrophes of the beheading, the challenges of the Age of Apostasy, and now the existential crisis of the era Indomitus demonstrated that its purpose transcended any particular era or set of circumstances. As long as the Imperium faced threats that conventional forces could not adequately counter, the Assassinorum would continue operating from the shadows, eliminating enemies whose deaths served the Emperor's vision for humanity's survival in a hostile galaxy.